Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Tonight, we're going to explore something curious, something that touches all of our lives, whether we notice it or not. The rhythm of the economy, the way prosperity and hardship seem to dance together in patterns that repeat over and over, roughly every 10 years or so. We'll discover why this happens, what it means, and perhaps most importantly, why even though we know these patterns exist, we seem unable to prevent them from recurring. By the end, I think you'll see that economic cycles aren't aberrations or failures, but something more fundamental, a reflection of human nature itself, woven into the fabric of how we exchange, build, and dream together. If you enjoy these calm explorations of economic patterns and their profound effects on human life, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of thoughtful listeners. So settle in, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, take a slow breath, in through your nose, out through your mouth. And let's begin our gentle drift through the patterns of boom and bust, expansion and contraction, optimism and fear. There's nowhere you need to be, no deadlines to meet. Just listen and let the story unfold like a long, quiet conversation between old friends. Let it wash over you. If you drift away, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Let's begin by thinking about rhythm itself. Everything in nature has rhythm. The seasons turn from spring to summer to autumn to winter and then back again. The tides rise and fall with the moon's pull. Day gives way to night gives way to day. Our own hearts beat in steady rhythm. Our lungs expand and contract. Our bodies cycle through waking and sleeping. Rhythm isn't an accident or a flaw in how the universe works. It's fundamental to existence itself. The economy, it turns out, has rhythm too. And this shouldn't surprise us because the economy isn't some abstract machine operating in a realm separate from nature and human life. It's made of us. It's the sum of all our decisions to buy or save, to invest or hoard, to expand or contract, to hope or fear. And because we're rhythmic creatures, living in a rhythmic world, the economy pulses with rhythms of its own. Economists have a technical term for this rhythm. They call it the business cycle. The name is dry, almost boring, but what it describes is anything but. The business cycle is the pattern of expansion and contraction that economies move through again and again in waves that have been observed for as long as people have been keeping track. These cycles aren't perfectly regular. They're not like clockwork, ticking away with mechanical precision. But they are remarkably consistent in their general pattern, rising and falling in a dance that seems to repeat roughly every 8 to 12 years, with 10 years being a kind of average around which the variations cluster. Let's think about what a cycle actually looks like slowly and carefully, so we can understand its shape. Every cycle has 4 phases, 4 distinct moments in the rhythm. First comes expansion. This is when the economy grows, when businesses hire more workers, when wages rise, when people feel confident enough to spend money and make investments. Expansion is the inhale, the gathering of energy, the sense that things are getting better and will continue to get better. During expansion, unemployment falls, new businesses open, construction cranes dot city skylines. People talk about the future with optimism. The mood is one of possibility. Expansion continues for a while, sometimes for several years, until it reaches what economists call the peak. The peak is that moment of maximum expansion, when the economy is operating at or near its full capacity, when almost everyone who wants a job has one, when businesses are running at full speed. The peak is a turning point, though it's usually only recognized as such in hindsight. At the time, it often just feels like continued good fortune, like prosperity that has become normal and expected. But after the peak comes contraction. This is the exhale, the release, the downturn. During contraction, economic activity slows. Businesses reduce production and cut workers. Unemployment rises. People become cautious about spending, preferring to save what they have rather than risk it on purchases or investments. Confidence, which seemed so solid during expansion, begins to evaporate. The mood shifts from optimism to worry, from confidence to caution. Contraction is when headlines speak of recession, when dinner table conversations turn to concerns about job security and paying bills. Contraction continues until the economy reaches what's called the trough, the lowest point in the cycle, when economic activity is at its weakest. The trough is another turning point, a moment when things stop getting worse and begin, slowly, to stabilize. And then, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the cycle begins again. Expansion starts from the trough, building momentum, gathering strength, and the whole pattern repeats. This pattern, expansion, peak, contraction, trough, and back to expansion, has repeated throughout recorded economic history. We can trace it back centuries to times when economies were primarily agricultural, when most people worked the land and cities were small. Even then, there were cycles of plenty and scarcity, of boom and bust. The specific causes changed depending on the era and the nature of the economy, but the pattern persisted. In agricultural societies, cycles often followed the harvest. A series of good harvests would bring prosperity. Granaries full, prices low, farmers able to buy goods and services from craftsmen and merchants. But then might come a bad harvest, perhaps from drought or flood or pestilence, and suddenly scarcity would spread through the economy like ripples in a pond. Food prices would spike. People would have less money to spend on anything beyond survival. Craftsmen and merchants would see demand fall. The contraction would continue until the next good harvest restored balance. As economies industrialized and became more complex, the cycles became less tied to agriculture and more tied to other factors: investment in factories and machinery, the availability of credit, the confidence of business owners and consumers. But the essential pattern remained: expansion and contraction, boom and bust. The rhythm continued, adapting to new circumstances but never disappearing. One of the first economists to seriously study these cycles was a Frenchman named Clement Juglar, who worked in the mid-1800s. Juglar noticed that crises seemed to occur with surprising regularity. Roughly every 8 to 11 years, he studied financial records going back decades and found the pattern repeating again and again. He concluded that these cycles weren't random events or the result of specific mistakes or bad luck, but were instead inherent to the capitalist economic system itself. This was a revolutionary idea at the time. It suggested that booms and busts weren't aberrations to be prevented, but natural rhythms to be understood and navigated. In the early 20th century, an economist named Joseph Schumpeter expanded on this understanding. Schumpeter saw cycles not as problems to be solved, but as essential to economic progress. He believed that during booms, entrepreneurs experiment with new ideas, new technologies, new ways of organizing production. Some of these experiments succeed spectacularly. Others fail. The bust phase, painful as it is, serves a purpose. It clears away the failures, freeing up resources for the next wave of innovation. Schumpeter called this process creative destruction, and he saw it as the engine of long-term economic growth. Not all economists agreed with Schumpeter's rather philosophical acceptance of cycles. John Maynard Keynes, writing during the Great Depression of the 1930s, believed that cycles could and should be moderated through government action. Keynes argued that the bust phase created unnecessary suffering, that unemployment and poverty during downturns weren't necessary or beneficial, but were instead failures of the economic system that could be ameliorated through wise policy. The debate between these views, whether cycles are natural and even beneficial, or whether they're problems that can be solved, continues to this day. But before we dive deeper into causes and solutions, let's sit with this basic idea for a moment. Let it settle. The economy has rhythm. It expands and contracts. It always has. And despite our increasing knowledge and sophisticated policy tools, it still does. This rhythm affects all of us, whether we pay attention to economics or not. It determines whether jobs are plentiful or scarce, whether wages rise or stagnate, whether the general mood is optimistic or anxious. Understanding this rhythm doesn't make downturns any less difficult for those who experience them. Knowing that a recession is part of a natural economic cycle doesn't pay your bills if you've lost your job. But understanding can provide a kind of perspective, a way of seeing your personal struggles as part of something larger, something that has happened before and will happen again, something that, historically, has always eventually given way to recovery. There's also something about understanding cycles that can be oddly comforting. If we know that downturns end, that expansions follow contractions as surely as spring follows winter, then even in difficult times we can hold on to the knowledge that change is coming. The trough gives way to expansion, the exhale gives way to the inhale, the rhythm continues. At the heart of these cycles is something profoundly human: our psychology, our emotions, our tendency to swing between optimism and pessimism, between confidence and fear. Keynes had a term for this. He called it animal spirits. He meant the emotional and instinctive elements that drive economic decisions, the parts of our decision-making that aren't purely rational calculations of self-interest, but are instead driven by gut feelings, by moods, by the contagious enthusiasm or anxiety of those around us. When people feel optimistic, when animal spirits are high, they spend more freely. They're willing to borrow money to start businesses or buy houses or invest in stocks. This spending creates jobs and income for others, who then spend their income, creating a positive feedback loop. Optimism breeds more optimism. Confidence feeds on itself. The economy expands, but the same mechanism works in reverse. When people feel pessimistic, when animal spirits sink, they pull back. They save rather than spend. They avoid borrowing. Businesses, sensing reduced demand, cut back on production and hiring. This creates unemployment, which further reduces spending, which creates more unemployment. Pessimism breeds more pessimism. Fear feeds on itself. The economy contracts. This psychological element helps explain why cycles are so persistent and so difficult to prevent. Human psychology hasn't changed fundamentally over the centuries. We're still prone to the same swings between excessive optimism and excessive pessimism, the same tendency to assume that current conditions will continue indefinitely, the same difficulty learning from the past. Each generation seems to rediscover the boom-bust cycle for itself, often believing during the boom that this time things are different, that we've figured out how to sustain prosperity permanently. But we haven't. Not yet. And perhaps we never will, because the cycles aren't just about policy or economic structure. They're about us, about how we think and feel and react to the world around us, about our tendency to follow the crowd, to believe what we want to believe, to get caught up in the excitement of a boom or the fear of a bust. This isn't a criticism. It's simply observation. We are human, with all the limitations and contradictions that entails. The economy is human too, reflecting our nature back at us in patterns of expansion and contraction, optimism and fear, building and rebuilding. As we continue through this exploration, we'll look more closely at how these cycles unfold, how booms begin and why they go too far, how crashes happen and why they're so painful, why the pattern repeats roughly every 10 years, and what, if anything, we can do about it. But for now, let this basic framework settle in your mind. Cycles exist. They're natural, they're persistent, they're human. And understanding them is the first step toward living with them more wisely, more gracefully, with less surprise and perhaps a bit more equanimity when the inevitable turns come. Let your breathing slow. Let the rhythm of your own breath mirror the rhythm we've been discussing, the inhale of expansion, the pause at the peak, the exhale of contraction, the quiet moment at the trough before the next breath begins. You're safe here. The cycles we're discussing are patterns in the world, but you yourself are safe, comfortable, at rest. If you drift off now, that's perfectly fine. The story will continue without you, and you can return to it another time if you wish. Let's move deeper now into how these cycles actually work, starting with the most seductive phase, the boom, when everything seems possible and the future looks bright. Think about the moment when a recession ends and expansion begins. The economy has been contracting. Unemployment is high. Businesses have been cautious, cutting back, hoarding cash. Consumers have been saving rather than spending, worried about the future. But then, gradually, something shifts. Perhaps it's been long enough that the worst of the previous crisis has passed and been digested. Perhaps interest rates have been lowered by central banks to encourage borrowing. Perhaps some new technology or innovation has captured people's imagination. Perhaps it's simply that pessimism, like optimism, can only sustain itself for so long before exhaustion sets in and the mood begins to change. Whatever the trigger, expansion begins modestly at first. A few businesses start to hire again. A few consumers, feeling slightly more confident, begin to spend a bit more. These small actions have ripple effects. The newly hired workers now have income to spend. The businesses that sell to consumers start to see demand increase. They hire more workers to meet that demand. Those workers spend their income. The cycle feeds on itself, but in a positive direction now. Credit plays a crucial role in this early expansion phase. Banks, which were cautious about lending during the downturn, begin to loosen their standards slightly. Business owners who were rejected for loans 6 months ago are now approved. The availability of credit allows businesses to invest in new equipment, to expand production, to hire workers even before they've secured all the customers they'll need. Credit allows consumers to buy cars and houses and appliances, spending money they don't quite have yet but expect to earn in the future. This credit expansion is like pouring fuel on the fire of recovery. It accelerates the expansion, allows it to build momentum faster than it could through savings and existing resources alone, and in the early stages of expansion. This credit creation is generally healthy and productive. Businesses that get loans use them to invest in genuinely useful activities. Consumers who borrow are typically making reasonable assessments of their ability to repay. The expansion feels solid and justified. As expansion continues and gathers strength, innovation often plays a starring role. New technologies or business methods emerge, or existing ones become more widely adopted. Think about the railroads in the 1800s, which opened up new markets and transformed how goods and people moved, or electricity in the early 1900s, which revolutionized manufacturing and daily life, or computers and the internet in the late 20th century, or smartphones and social media in the early 21st century. These innovations create genuine improvements in productivity. They allow businesses to produce more with the same amount of labor and capital. They create new products and services that people want. They open up new industries entirely. The early adopters of these innovations often see spectacular success. Their stock prices soar. Their founders become wealthy. Stories of their success spread, inspiring others to emulate them. This is where Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction becomes visible. The new industries grow rapidly, creating jobs and wealth. But the old industries that are being displaced contract. Railroads displaced canals and stagecoaches. Automobiles displaced horses and buggy makers. Digital media displaced newspapers and traditional television. This destruction is painful for those in the declining industries, but the economy as a whole grows because the new industries are more productive and create more value than what they're replacing. As the expansion continues, a wonderful thing happens. Unemployment falls. This might seem like a simple and obvious consequence of economic growth, but it's worth pausing to appreciate what falling unemployment means. It means people who are struggling to find work, who are anxious about paying their bills and supporting their families, are now employed. It means dignity restored, purpose regained, security re-established. The psychological and social benefits of falling unemployment ripple through communities in profound ways. With more people working, wage growth typically accelerates. When unemployment is high, workers have little bargaining power. There are many people competing for each job, so employers can keep wages low. But as unemployment falls and workers become scarcer, employers have to compete for workers by offering higher wages. This wage growth means workers have more money to spend, which further stimulates the economy. The expansion feeds on itself. Business confidence during this phase is remarkably high. Surveys of business owners and executives show rising optimism. Investment in new capacity increases. Companies expand their operations, open new locations, develop new products. The stock market, which is partly a measure of business confidence and partly a driver of it, rises steadily. People who own stocks see their wealth increase, which makes them feel richer and more willing to spend, which stimulates the economy further. Consumer confidence rises in tandem with business confidence. People expect the good times to continue. They expect their jobs to be secure and their wages to rise. This confidence makes them willing to make major purchases, to buy houses, cars, appliances. It makes them willing to take on debt because they're confident they'll be able to repay it. Consumer spending, which makes up the majority of economic activity in modern economies, grows robustly. This is when things start to feel almost magical. The economy seems to have found a sweet spot where everything is working well. Jobs are plentiful, wages are rising, businesses are thriving. Stock portfolios are growing, housing values are increasing. Government tax revenues rise with economic activity, allowing governments to increase spending on services or reduce deficits. Social problems that seemed intractable during the downturn start to ease as prosperity spreads. It's during this phase that a dangerous belief often takes hold. The belief that this time is different, that we've somehow transcended the old patterns of boom and bust, that we've figured out how to sustain prosperity indefinitely. This belief has emerged during virtually every major expansion in history. In the 1920s, people believed that modern business methods and the Federal Reserve's management had eliminated the boom-bust cycle. In the 1990s, people believed that the internet and information technology had created a new economy, where old rules no longer applied. In the 2000s, people believed that modern financial instruments and risk management had made the financial system safer and more stable than ever before. Each time this belief proved to be an illusion. But it's a seductive illusion, because it allows people to justify behaviours that would otherwise seem risky or excessive. If you believe that prosperity will continue indefinitely, then borrowing large amounts of money seems reasonable. If you believe that stock prices or housing prices will keep rising forever, then paying prices that seem expensive relative to historical norms seems justified. If you believe that risk has been eliminated or tamed, then taking on more risk seems acceptable. And so, gradually, subtly, the expansion begins to shift from healthy growth to excess. The shift is hard to pinpoint. There's no clear moment when things tip from one to the other, but over time certain patterns emerge. Debt levels rise faster than incomes. Asset prices, stocks, real estate, sometimes commodities, rise faster than the underlying fundamentals would justify. Investment flows into projects that are increasingly speculative, increasingly based on extrapolating current trends indefinitely into the future, rather than on careful assessment of likely returns. Credit standards loosen further. Loans that would have been rejected as too risky a year or two ago are now approved. The financial sector grows as a share of the economy, as the creation and trading of financial instruments becomes increasingly profitable. Leverage, the use of borrowed money to amplify returns, increases. When leverage works in your favour, when assets are rising in value, it's wonderful. A small investment with borrowed money can produce spectacular returns, but leverage works both ways, amplifying losses as well as gains. The mood during this late expansion phase is complicated. There's still widespread optimism and celebration of wealth creation. But there's also a growing sense among some observers that things have gone too far, that prices are too high, that risks are being underestimated. These skeptics are often dismissed as perennial pessimists, as people who quote one who don't understand the new paradigm. The momentum of the boom makes it socially and professionally difficult to express doubt. People who work in finance often describe feeling during this phase like they have to keep dancing while the music is playing. They can see that the party might be getting out of hand, but stopping early means missing out on profits that everyone else is still making. The pressure to conform, to keep participating, is immense. The fear of missing out, of being the one person who sat out the boom and watched everyone else get rich, overrides more cautious instincts. This is where the psychological element of cycles becomes so important. It's not that everyone involved is foolish or irrational. Many people have nagging doubts. But humans are social creatures. We take cues from those around us. When everyone else is optimistic, when everyone else is making money, when skepticism is met with dismissal or mockery, it's extraordinarily difficult to stand apart. We want to believe that the good times will continue because believing otherwise is uncomfortable and costly. The late boom phase also sees important changes in who is participating in the market. In the early stages of expansion, it's often sophisticated investors and business people who drive growth. But as the boom continues and stories of easy wealth spread, less sophisticated participants enter. Individual investors who've never bought stocks before open brokerage accounts. People who've never invested in real estate before start buying properties to flip. The entry of these new participants provides more fuel for the boom, pushing prices higher and making it seem like the good times will never end. But here's the thing about booms that go too far. They create the conditions for their own demise. The very excess that makes the late boom feel so exhilarating is what makes the system fragile. High levels of debt mean that a small decline in income or asset values can leave borrowers unable to repay. High asset prices based on optimistic assumptions mean that any disappointment in those assumptions can trigger sharp declines. Overinvestment in certain sectors means that those sectors will eventually have too much capacity, leading to falling prices and profits. Central banks often contribute to the eventual end of the boom, though usually with good intentions. As expansion continues and unemployment falls to very low levels, central banks start to worry about inflation. When everyone who wants a job has one and wages are rising rapidly, there's a risk that too much money will chase too few goods, driving up prices across the economy. To prevent this, central banks raise interest rates, making borrowing more expensive and saving more attractive. The goal is to cool the economy gently, to bring it to what's called a soft landing, a gentle slowdown that prevents inflation without causing a recession. Sometimes this works. But often it doesn't, because the economy during a late boom is like a car going too fast on a curvy road. Small adjustments to the steering can have large effects. Higher interest rates make debt more expensive to service. They make the calculations that justified high asset prices suddenly look questionable. They can pop bubbles that have formed. What happens next? The turn from expansion to contraction, from boom to bust, is the subject we'll explore as we continue. But for now, rest here in this understanding of how booms develop, how they gather momentum, how they shift from healthy growth to excess, how they contain within themselves the seeds of their eventual reversal. The pattern is remarkably consistent across time and place and specific circumstance. Human nature drives it. The availability of credit amplifies it. Innovation justifies it. And the belief that this time is different perpetuates it until reality eventually intrudes. Let your mind drift with this understanding. See if you can recognize elements of this pattern in your own lifetime, in expansions you've witnessed or read about. Notice how natural it all seems in retrospect, how inevitable, even though during the boom it felt like prosperity might last forever. The pattern continues, generation after generation, not because we're foolish, but because we're human, with all the beautiful and frustrating limitations that entails. If you're feeling sleepy now, that's wonderful. Let yourself drift. The expansion we've been discussing will wait patiently for you. The cycles will continue their rhythm whether you're awake to observe them or not. Rest now, comfortable in the knowledge that these patterns, while powerful, are knowable, predictable in their general shape if not in their specific timing. Rest in the understanding that booms end. But so do busts. Everything is temporary, everything is cyclical, everything eventually gives way to something else. Let that knowledge bring peace as you settle deeper into sleep. We've explored how economic cycles work in their broad strokes, how expansion follows contraction in patterns that repeat with remarkable regularity. We've seen how booms begin modestly and gather strength, how optimism feeds on itself, how credit expands and innovation drives growth. Now let's look more closely at what happens during these boom times, at the anatomy of expansion itself, how it unfolds, what it feels like to live through, and most importantly, how healthy growth gradually transforms into something more dangerous. Let's start by imagining the moment when recovery truly takes hold, when the economy has passed through the trough and expansion is unmistakably underway. This is often a time of enormous relief. The previous recession, with its job losses and business failures and general anxiety, is fading into memory. People who were worried about their economic security are starting to relax. Companies that were struggling are starting to see their fortunes improve. The mood is shifting from fear to cautious optimism. In these early stages of expansion, growth feels earned and sustainable. Businesses are hiring because they genuinely need more workers to meet increasing demand. Consumers are spending because their incomes are rising and they feel more secure. The increases in stock prices and real estate values reflect improving fundamentals. Companies really are becoming more profitable, and the demand for housing really is increasing. There's nothing particularly speculative or excessive about this early expansion growth. It's simply the economy recovering from having been depressed, returning to something closer to its normal, healthy functioning. Credit begins to flow more freely during this phase, but in ways that make perfect sense. Banks had pulled back sharply during the recession, refusing loans even to credit-worthy borrowers because the uncertainty was too great. Now, with the economic picture brightening, banks start to lend again. A small business owner who was denied a loan to expand 6 months ago might now be approved. The business uses that loan to hire workers, to purchase inventory, to market their products. The loan creates activity and jobs that wouldn't have existed otherwise, and the business generates enough revenue to repay the loan with interest. Everyone benefits. Similarly, consumers who had postponed major purchases during the downturn now feel comfortable making them. Perhaps they've been driving an aging car that needs frequent repairs, but during the recession they couldn't justify taking on an auto loan. Now, with employment stable and the economic outlook improving, they buy a new car. The automobile dealer makes a sale. The manufacturer receives an order. Workers at the factory have secure jobs. The financial institution that provided the auto loan earns interest. The consumer gets reliable transportation. Again, everyone benefits. This is what economists would call productive credit creation, borrowing that finances genuine economic activity, that creates value, that can be repaid from the income generated by the activity itself. It's credit serving its proper function in a modern economy, allowing worthy projects to proceed sooner than they could if everyone had to save up the full amount before beginning. Innovation often plays a particularly important role in driving expansion. Sometimes a new technology that was developed during the previous downturn or even earlier begins to be adopted widely. sometimes entirely new technologies emerge. These innovations genuinely improve productivity. They allow people to produce more goods or better services with the same amount of effort and resources. Think about the spread of electricity in the early 1900s. When factories switched from steam power to electric power, they could reorganize their entire production process. Steam power had required centralized engines with belts and pulleys running to individual machines. Electric motors allowed each machine to have its own power source, giving factory owners flexibility to arrange their facilities more efficiently. This wasn't hype or speculation. It was real improvement in productivity that made businesses genuinely more profitable and created real value for society. Or think about the personal computer revolution of the 1980s and early 1990s. When computers became affordable enough for businesses and households, they enabled new ways of working, new kinds of software, new forms of communication. The productivity gains were real. A secretary who once spent hours retyping documents could now edit them electronically. An accountant who once did calculations by hand or with an adding machine could now use spreadsheet software. These improvements meant that the same person could accomplish more in the same amount of time, creating genuine economic value. When such innovations are occurring during an economic expansion, they provide fundamental justification for optimism. It's not just that people are feeling good or that credit is available. It's that the economy is actually becoming more productive, more capable of generating wealth. Stock prices rise during these periods, not just because investors are optimistic, but because companies really are becoming more valuable. The expansion has solid foundations. As expansion continues and strengthens, unemployment falls in ways that matter profoundly for ordinary people's lives. Imagine a worker who was laid off during the recession and spent months searching for a new job, sending out resume after resume, going on interview after interview, facing rejection after rejection. The psychological toll of prolonged unemployment is severe. The loss of routine and purpose, the financial stress, the erosion of self-confidence, the strain on relationships. Now imagine that same person finally getting hired as the expansion gains momentum. Suddenly they have income again. They can pay their bills without constantly juggling and prioritizing. They can make plans for the future. Their mood improves. Their relationships stabilize. This individual recovery story multiplies millions of times over as unemployment falls from, say, 8% to 6% to 4%. Each percentage point represents hundreds of thousands of people finding work, regaining dignity and security. As more people find employment, wage growth typically begins to accelerate. This happens naturally through supply and demand. When unemployment is high, workers have little bargaining power. If they ask for a raise or complain about conditions, the employer can easily replace them from the large pool of unemployed workers desperate for jobs. But as unemployment falls and workers become scarcer, the balance of power shifts. Employers who want to attract and retain good workers have to pay more. Wages rise. This wage growth is enormously important for sustaining the expansion. Remember that consumer spending makes up about 2/3 to 3/4 of total economic activity in modern developed economies. When wages are rising, consumers have more money to spend. They buy more goods and services. This spending creates demand that businesses respond to by expanding production and hiring more workers, whose wages then contribute to further spending. The positive feedback loop strengthens. Housing markets often become particularly active during expansions. This makes intuitive sense. Buying a home is the largest financial commitment most people ever make. During recessions, when job security is uncertain and the economic outlook is grim, most people postpone home buying. But as expansion takes hold and confidence returns, the pent-up demand gets released. Young couples who had been living with parents or in rental apartments decide it's finally time to buy. Growing families who need more space take the plunge. First-time buyers enter the market in increasing numbers. This surge in housing demand has powerful economic effects. Construction workers are hired to build new homes. Suppliers of lumber, concrete, fixtures and appliances see their sales increase. Real estate agents, mortgage brokers, title companies, and others in the housing industry do more business. Furniture stores and home improvement retailers benefit as new homeowners furnish and improve their properties. The ripple effects spread through the economy. The stock market, that great barometer of collective economic sentiment, typically rises substantially during expansions. In the early and middle phases of expansion, this rise generally reflects improving corporate fundamentals. Companies are selling more products and services as consumer and business spending increases. Their revenues grow. Their profit margins often expand as they spread fixed costs over higher volumes. Their profits rise, sometimes quite dramatically. And as profits rise, so do stock prices. Individual investors who own stocks directly or through retirement accounts see their portfolio values increase. This creates what economists call the wealth effect. When people feel wealthier because their investments have grown in value, they tend to spend more even if their current income hasn't changed. Someone who sees their retirement account grow by $20,000 might feel comfortable spending an extra $1,000 on a vacation or home improvement project. Multiply this across millions of investors, and the wealth effect can meaningfully boost consumer spending. For business owners and entrepreneurs, the expansion phase is often exhilarating. Demand for their products or services is strong and growing. They're able to hire the workers they need. They're making profits that allow them to invest in their businesses, to expand, to try new things. The successful ones become community success stories. They create jobs. They contribute to the tax base. They sponsor local events and charities. The vitality of local business communities contributes to a general sense that things are going well. Government finances typically improve during expansions, though this happens somewhat quietly and doesn't get as much attention as the more visible signs of prosperity. As employment rises and incomes grow, tax revenues increase. People earning wages pay income taxes and payroll taxes. Businesses making profits pay corporate taxes. Consumers buying goods and services pay sales taxes. Property owners benefiting from rising real estate values pay higher property taxes. Meanwhile, government spending on unemployment insurance and other safety net programs falls as fewer people need assistance. Budget deficits shrink or turn into surpluses. This improvement in government finances can create a virtuous cycle. Governments might use increased revenues to improve infrastructure, to enhance education, to provide better public services, or they might reduce tax rates, leaving more money in private hands to be spent or invested. Either approach can support continued expansion. The general mood during the middle phase of a strong expansion is remarkably positive. People feel good about their economic situations and their prospects. Survey data on consumer confidence shows rising optimism. People expect their incomes to rise. They expect jobs to be plentiful. They expect good times to continue. This optimism becomes self-fulfilling to some degree. When people expect good times, they behave in ways that help create good times. Media coverage during expansions tends to celebrate economic success. Business publications profile successful entrepreneurs and innovative companies. News programs report on strong job growth and rising stock markets. Magazine covers declare that prosperity has arrived or that we're in a new golden age. This celebratory coverage reinforces the positive mood and contributes to the sense that the expansion will continue indefinitely. It's during this middle to late phase of expansion that something subtle but crucial begins to happen. The character of the expansion starts to change. The shift is gradual and hard to detect in real time, but looking back it becomes clear. What was once healthy growth based on solid fundamentals begins to incorporate more speculative elements, more optimistic assumptions, more faith that the good times will continue. Credit expansion, which was productive and sustainable in the early phases, begins to extend further and further. Lending standards loosen incrementally. A bank that once required borrowers to have 20% down payment for a home mortgage might lower the requirement to 15%, then 10%, then 5%, then even offer loans with no down payment at all. Each individual relaxation of standards seems reasonable at the time. After all, the economy is strong, unemployment is low, home prices are rising, so the risk of default seems minimal. Similarly, loans that once required extensive documentation of income and assets might be approved with less scrutiny. Stated income loans become more common, where borrowers simply state what they earn without having to provide tax returns or pay stubs to verify it. In a booming economy where employment is strong and incomes are rising, this seems acceptable. The loans are still being repaid. Defaults remain low. Why maintain overly burdensome documentation requirements? Corporations also tend to take on more debt during the late expansion phase. They borrow to fund expansion, to acquire other companies, to buy back their own shares and thus boost stock prices. Much of this borrowing can be justified. If a company has profitable investment opportunities and can borrow at low interest rates, it makes financial sense to do so. But gradually, borrowing starts to be used for activities that are more about financial engineering than productive investment, more about boosting short-term results than building long-term value. Leverage increases throughout the financial system. Leverage is simply the use of borrowed money to amplify potential returns. It's a powerful tool. If you invest $10,000 of your own money and make a 10% return, you've earned $1,000. But if you invest $10,000 of your own money and $90,000 of borrowed money, investing a total of $100,000 at the same 10% return, you've earned $10,000 minus the interest on the loan, but still a much larger absolute return. Leverage amplifies gains. Of course, leverage also amplifies losses. If that $100,000 investment falls by 10%, you've lost $10,000, all of your own money, plus you still owe the $90,000 you borrowed plus interest. During expansions, when asset prices are generally rising, the downside of leverage gets forgotten or minimized. Everyone focuses on the amplified gains. Asset prices begin to rise faster than the underlying fundamentals would justify. Stock prices, for instance, might rise faster than the growth in corporate earnings. This creates what's called multiple expansion. The price-to-earnings ratio increases because investors are willing to pay more for each dollar of corporate earnings. In the early expansion, a stock might trade at 15 times its annual earnings. Later in the expansion, that same stock might trade at 20 times earnings, or 25 times, or even higher. This multiple expansion can be partially justified by falling interest rates, which make future earnings more valuable, or by expectations that earnings will grow faster in the future than they have in the past. But often the expansion of valuation multiples simply reflects increasing optimism, a willingness to pay higher prices because of confidence that prices will continue to rise. Real estate markets often show similar patterns. Housing prices rise faster than incomes or rents. This creates affordability challenges, but during the boom, these challenges are rationalized away. People convince themselves that it makes sense to stretch financially to buy a home, because prices are only going to keep rising. The idea of being, quote, 3 if you don't buy now creates urgency and justifies paying prices that seem high by historical standards. Certain sectors of the economy become particularly hot during late expansions, attracting disproportionate investment and attention. In the late 1920s, it was radio stocks and other new technology companies. In the late 1990s, it was internet and technology stocks. In the mid-2000s, it was housing and finance. These hot sectors seem to represent the future, to be where the smart money's going, to be the source of enormous wealth creation. Stories of spectacular success in these sectors spread widely and attract more participants. Someone who bought stock in an internet company in 1996 and saw it increase tenfold by 1999 becomes a model that others want to emulate. Someone who bought a house in a desirable neighborhood in 2003 and saw its value double by 2006 convinces friends and family to get in on the opportunity. This is when less sophisticated investors begin to enter markets in large numbers. People who had never owned individual stocks before open brokerage accounts. People who had never invested in real estate beyond their primary residence start buying properties as investments. The entry of these new participants provides additional fuel for the boom, but it also signals that the expansion is reaching its late stages. When taxi drivers and barbers are giving stock tips, or when everyone at a dinner party is talking about their real estate investments, the boom has become broadly popular and probably quite mature. The financial sector tends to grow as a share of the overall economy during expansions, and especially during late expansions. As more lending and investing occurs, as financial assets increase in value, as new financial instruments are created and traded, the profits of banks and investment firms grow. The smartest students graduating from top universities increasingly choose careers in finance, attracted by the high salaries and bonuses. The best and brightest minds of a generation spend their time creating complex financial instruments and trading strategies, rather than curing diseases or teaching or building things. This expansion of finance isn't necessarily bad. Financial markets serve important functions in allocating capital and managing risk. But when finance becomes too large a share of the economy, when too much talent and too many resources flow into financial activities rather than productive activities, it can be a warning sign that the expansion has become unbalanced. Media coverage of business and finance becomes increasingly breathless and celebratory. Magazine covers feature successful investors and entrepreneurs. Television shows about business and investing proliferate. Books promising to reveal the secrets of wealth creation become bestsellers. A culture of financial success permeates society. People who made a lot of money in the stock market or real estate are treated as geniuses, as if they possess special insight rather than having benefited from favorable timing and rising markets. This celebration of financial success can create pressure to participate even for those who have doubts. If everyone around you is making money in the stock market or real estate, if dinner party conversations constantly turn to investment returns and how much homes have appreciated, if you see neighbours and colleagues becoming wealthier while you sit on the sidelines, the fear of missing out becomes powerful. The social and psychological pressure to join the boom can override more cautious financial instincts. Professional investors face similar pressures. A fund manager who sits out the late stages of a boom because valuations seem too high will underperform peers who remain fully invested. Clients will withdraw their money and move it to managers with better recent returns. Even if the cautious manager is ultimately proven right when the boom ends, their career might not survive the period of underperformance. This creates powerful incentives to keep dancing while the music plays. As one famous investor put it, even when you suspect the party might be ending soon. The late expansion phase often sees interesting changes in corporate behaviour. Companies that are flush with cash and facing pressure to deliver ever higher returns engage in increasingly aggressive strategies. They might make large acquisitions, paying high prices for target companies in hopes of achieving growth through consolidation. They might engage in share buybacks, purchasing their own stock in the market to boost prices and earnings per share. They might take on debt to fund expansion into new markets or new products. Some of these strategies work out well, but many acquisitions made during late expansions prove to have been done at inflated prices, destroying shareholder value rather than creating it. Many expansion plans prove to have been based on overly optimistic projections of continued strong demand. The pressure to maintain momentum, to keep delivering the growth that investors have come to expect, can lead to poor decision-making. Perhaps most importantly, the late expansion phase sees the emergence of a dangerous belief that this time is different. Every major boom in history has been accompanied by this belief. The specific rationale changes. Sometimes it's new technology, sometimes it's improved policy, sometimes it's better risk management, sometimes it's demographic trends or globalization or financial innovation. But the core idea is always the same. The old rules no longer apply. The old patterns of boom and bust have been transcended. We've entered a new era where prosperity can be sustained indefinitely. In the 1920s, the belief was that modern business methods, the Federal Reserve's management of the economy, and new technologies like radio and automobiles had eliminated the business cycle. Irving Fisher, one of the most prominent economists of the era, famously declared in October of 1929, just days before the stock market crash, that stock prices had reached what looked like a permanently high plateau. That phrase, permanently high plateau, captures the essence of late boom thinking. The idea that what goes up might come down seemed outdated, pessimistic, out of touch with modern realities. In the late 1990s, the belief was that the internet and information technology had created a new economy where traditional metrics of valuation didn't matter. Companies with no profits and sometimes no revenue commanded valuations in the billions of dollars because investors believed they were building the businesses of the future. Traditional investors who pointed out that these companies had never made money and had no clear path to profitability were dismissed as old-fashioned, as people who didn't understand the new paradigm. In the mid-2000s, the belief was that sophisticated financial engineering and risk management had made the financial system safer and more stable than ever before. Mortgages were bundled into securities that were sliced into tranches rated by credit agencies. These mortgage-backed securities were then used as collateral for further borrowing. The complexity was supposed to distribute risk and make the system more resilient. The idea that a nationwide decline in housing prices could bring down the entire financial system seemed far-fetched to many smart people. In each case, the belief that this time was different served an important psychological function. It allowed people to rationalize behavior that would otherwise seem risky or excessive. If you truly believe that stock prices will keep rising indefinitely, then paying high prices for stocks seems reasonable. If you truly believe that housing prices never fall nationwide, then lending money to borrowers who can barely afford the payments seems acceptable. If you truly believe that financial innovation has eliminated risk, then taking on enormous leverage seems prudent. This belief makes the late boom phase feel almost magical. Everyone seems to be getting wealthier. The economy is strong, unemployment is low, confidence is high. Problems that seemed intractable during the previous recession have faded away. There's a sense of collective accomplishment, a feeling that we've figured out how to sustain prosperity, that we've matured as an economy and as a society. But underneath this surface confidence, stresses are building. Debt levels rise faster than incomes, meaning that more and more of people's income must go to servicing debt rather than being available for spending or saving. Asset prices rise to levels that are increasingly disconnected from underlying fundamentals, supported mainly by the expectation of further price increases. Investment flows into projects and ventures that make sense only if optimistic projections prove accurate. The economy becomes fragile, vulnerable to shocks or disappointments that would have been easily absorbed earlier in the expansion. The role of central banks becomes particularly important in the late expansion phase. Central banks, like the Federal Reserve in the United States, have a dual mandate: to maintain price stability and to promote maximum employment. During expansions, as unemployment falls to very low levels and the economy runs hot, central banks start to worry about inflation. They fear that too much money chasing too few goods will cause prices to rise rapidly, eroding purchasing power and creating economic instability. To prevent overheating and inflation, central banks raise interest rates. This makes borrowing more expensive and saving more attractive. The goal is to cool the economy gently, to slow growth to a sustainable pace without causing a recession. This is called achieving a soft landing, and it's extremely difficult to pull off. The economy is complex and responds to interest rate changes with lags and in unpredictable ways. Sometimes the central bank raises rates, and the economy keeps expanding, barely slowing down. In these cases, the central bank might raise rates further, trying to tap the brakes harder. But sometimes the economy is more fragile than it appears, and even modest rate increases can trigger sharp slowdowns. The central bank is essentially trying to steer an enormous ship with imperfect instruments and limited visibility about what lies ahead. Higher interest rates have multiple effects that can cool an overheating economy. They make mortgages more expensive, which can slow housing markets. They make auto loans and other consumer credit more expensive, which can reduce consumer spending on big-ticket items. They make corporate borrowing more expensive, which can reduce business investment. They make the returns on safe investments like savings accounts and bonds more attractive, which can pull money out of stocks and other riskier assets. In a late expansion, when debt levels are high and asset prices are elevated, the effects of rising interest rates can be particularly potent. People and businesses that borrowed heavily when rates were low find that as rates rise, a larger share of their income must go to servicing debt. Companies whose high stock valuations were justified partly by low interest rates find their valuations under pressure as rates rise. Real estate investors who relied on low mortgage rates to make their investments profitable find that higher rates squeeze their returns. The late boom phase, then, is characterized by a combination of genuine prosperity and increasing fragility. People are doing well by many measures. Employment is high, wages are rising, asset values are increasing. But the foundations of this prosperity are becoming less solid. Debt is accumulating, valuations are stretched, risks are being underestimated, behavior that would be sustainable in moderation has been taken to extremes, and the central bank is beginning to tighten monetary policy, removing the easy credit conditions that helped fuel the expansion. At some point, and the timing is impossible to predict precisely, something shifts. The expansion reaches its peak. Confidence begins to waver. The first cracks appear in the edifice of prosperity. What happens next, how the boom gives way to bust, how confidence transforms into panic, is a process we'll explore as we continue our journey through the cycles. But rest here for now with this understanding of how expansions develop and mature. See how natural it all is, how each step follows logically from the previous one, how the seeds of excess are planted during the healthy early growth and gradually sprout as the expansion continues. There's no villain in this story. No single mistake that causes everything to go wrong. Just human nature, our optimism, our tendency to extrapolate current conditions into the future, our susceptibility to crowd psychology, our difficulty learning from the past. If you're feeling drowsy now, let yourself drift. The cycles we're exploring will continue their eternal rhythm, whether you're awake to witness them or sleeping peacefully. The boom we've been examining will peak and give way to bust, but that's a story for another moment. For now, rest in the knowledge that you understand how expansions work, how they begin with genuine improvement and gradually transform into something more fragile and excessive. Rest in the understanding that this pattern has repeated countless times throughout history and will likely repeat again. Let that knowledge settle gently in your mind as you settle into sleep. We've been walking together through the expansion phase of economic cycles, watching how prosperity builds from modest beginnings into something more exuberant, more excessive, more fragile. We've seen how what begins as healthy growth gradually incorporates speculative elements, how confidence transforms into overconfidence, how sustainable practices give way to risky ones. Now we need to look at something more difficult, more uncomfortable. How expansions contain within themselves the seeds of their own destruction. How the very success of a boom creates the conditions for its eventual collapse. This is perhaps the most important insight about economic cycles. They don't end because of bad luck or external shocks, though those can certainly trigger or accelerate a downturn. Rather, cycles end because of forces set in motion during the boom itself. The expansion creates imbalances that eventually become unsustainable. The longer and stronger the boom, the larger these imbalances tend to grow, and the more painful the eventual correction tends to be. Let's think about debt, because debt is central to understanding how booms plant the seeds of busts. Debt is simply borrowing from the future. You receive money or purchasing power now in exchange for a promise to repay later, typically with interest. In moderate amounts and used productively, debt is enormously useful. It allows businesses to invest in expansion before they've accumulated all the necessary capital through retained earnings. It allows individuals to buy homes or finance education, investments in their future that would be impossible if they had to save up the full amount first. But debt has a crucial characteristic: it must be repaid regardless of how circumstances change. When you take out a mortgage to buy a house, you've committed to making monthly payments for 30 years. If your income rises over those 30 years, the payments become easier to manage. But if your income falls, or if you lose your job, those payments become a crushing burden. The debt remains fixed while your ability to service it varies with economic conditions. During expansions, debt accumulates throughout the economy. Households borrow to buy homes, cars, appliances. Businesses borrow to expand operations, build new facilities, acquire other companies. Governments sometimes borrow as well, though their borrowing patterns are more complex and influenced by political factors. The overall debt levels in the economy rise faster than incomes, meaning that debt-to-income ratios increase. In the early and middle stages of expansion, this rising debt is generally manageable. Incomes are growing, unemployment is falling, asset values are rising. A household that takes on a mortgage equal to 3 times their annual income can afford it, because their income is stable and likely to rise. A business that borrows to build a new factory can service the debt from the increased revenue the factory generates. Everything works smoothly. But as the expansion matures and debt continues to accumulate, the ratios become more stretched. Households might take on mortgages equal to 4 times annual income, or 5 times, or even more. Businesses might borrow amounts that leave little margin for error if revenues disappoint. The rising debt levels mean that more and more of the economy's income must go to servicing debt, paying interest and principal, rather than being available for consumption or investment. This creates what's called financial fragility. When debt levels are low, the economy can absorb setbacks relatively easily. If a recession hits and incomes fall by 5 or 10%, most borrowers can tighten their belts and continue making debt payments. But when debt levels are high, the same decline in income can push borrowers into default. They simply don't have enough income left after making debt payments to cover their other essential expenses. They must choose between making debt payments and buying food or medicine. Many choose to default. An economist named Hyman Minsky studied this progression carefully and developed what's come to be called the financial instability hypothesis. Minsky identified 3 types of borrowers in an economy. Hedge borrowers are the most conservative. Their income is sufficient to cover both interest and principal payments on their debts. Speculative borrowers have income sufficient to cover interest payments, but must roll over their debt, borrowing new money to repay principal when it comes due. Ponzi borrowers, named after the famous financial fraudster Charles Ponzi, cannot cover even their interest payments from income and must constantly borrow more just to stay current. In the early stages of an expansion, most borrowers are hedge borrowers. Lending standards are tight. Borrowers have substantial cushions of safety. But as the expansion continues and memories of the last recession fade, the composition shifts. More borrowers become speculative borrowers, relying on their ability to refinance when debts come due. Some become Ponzi borrowers, staying afloat only because asset values are rising and they can keep borrowing against their appreciating assets. This shift in borrower composition makes the economy increasingly unstable. A system dominated by hedge borrowers is robust. It can withstand shocks. But a system with many speculative and Ponzi borrowers is fragile. Any disruption to the ability to refinance, any decline in asset values, any reduction in income can trigger a cascade of defaults. Minsky argued that stability itself breeds instability. When the economy's doing well and has been stable for an extended period, people become more comfortable taking risks. Lenders loosen standards. Borrowers take on more debt. The very success of the expansion encourages the behaviours that will eventually undermine it. This is what Minsky meant when he said that stability is destabilising. The longer things go well, the more fragile the system becomes. Asset bubbles are another way that booms contain the seeds of their own destruction. A bubble occurs when the price of some asset, stocks, real estate, tulip bulbs, whatever, rises far above any reasonable estimate of its fundamental value. The price is sustained not by the income or utility the asset provides, but by the expectation that someone else will pay an even higher price in the future. Bubbles have occurred throughout economic history. One of the most famous early examples was the Dutch tulip mania of the 1630s. Tulips had been recently introduced to Europe from Turkey and became fashionable among wealthy Dutch merchants. As demand for rare tulip varieties increased, prices began to rise. The rising prices attracted speculators who bought tulip bulbs not because they wanted tulips, but because they expected prices to keep rising. At the peak of the mania, some tulip bulbs sold for amounts equal to 10 times a skilled craftsman's annual income. Then, as suddenly as it had inflated, the bubble collapsed. Prices plummeted. Those who had borrowed money to speculate in tulips were ruined. More recent examples include the stock market bubble of the late 1920s, the Japanese real estate and stock bubble of the late 1980s, the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s, and the housing bubble of the mid-2000s. Each had its own specific characteristics and causes, but they all followed a similar pattern. Prices rose initially for good reasons: genuine improvements in corporate profits, real economic growth, useful innovations. But then speculation took over. People bought not based on fundamental value but based on expected price appreciation. Prices became detached from any rational valuation, and eventually, inevitably, the bubble burst. The thing about bubbles is that they're remarkably difficult to identify with certainty while they're inflating. There's always a narrative that justifies the high prices. In the 1920s, it was the transformation of the economy through electrification, automobiles and radio. In the 1990s, it was the internet and the new economy. In the 2000s, it was the belief that nationwide declines in housing prices were impossible, and that financial innovation had made the system safer. These narratives aren't entirely false. The innovations and changes are real. The internet really did transform commerce and communication. The question is whether the price increases are justified by the actual value being created. And this question is genuinely difficult to answer in real time. Reasonable, intelligent people can and do disagree about whether an asset is fairly valued or in a bubble. This difficulty is compounded by the fact that questioning whether a bubble exists is professionally and socially costly during the boom. An investor who sits out what they think is a bubble watches their peers make spectacular returns. If the bubble continues for several more years, as many do, the skeptical investor looks foolish. Their clients leave, their career suffers. Even if they're eventually proven right when the bubble bursts, the damage to their reputation and livelihood may already be done. So there's tremendous pressure to participate, to rationalize the high prices, to believe the narrative that justifies them. A famous investor once compared this to a game of musical chairs. Everyone knows the music will eventually stop and there won't be enough chairs for everyone. But while the music is playing, you keep dancing. Sitting down early means accepting certain losses in the form of foregone gains, while staying in the game offers the possibility of getting out before the crash. Most people keep dancing. Bubbles create several problems beyond the obvious issue of inflated prices. First, they misallocate resources. During the dot-com bubble, vast amounts of capital flowed into internet startups, many of which had no viable business model. Money that could have been invested in genuinely productive enterprises was instead wasted on companies that would never generate returns. During the housing bubble, too many houses were built in locations where demand didn't justify the construction. Resources that could have been used for other purposes were consumed in building houses that would later sit vacant. Second, bubbles typically involve substantial leverage. People borrow money to buy the bubbling asset, which amplifies both the gains on the way up and the losses on the way down. When the bubble bursts, borrowers find themselves underwater. They owe more than their assets are worth. This debt overhang can suppress economic activity for years, as borrowers struggle to pay down debts and lenders become more cautious. Third, bubbles create wealth effects that reverse when they pop. During the bubble, people feel wealthier and spend more freely. But when asset prices crash, that perceived wealth disappears and spending contracts sharply. The boom in consumption supported by bubble-inflated wealth turns into a bust in consumption when the wealth evaporates. Malinvestment is a broader concept that encompasses bubbles but extends beyond them. The term refers to investment that appears profitable during the boom, but turns out to have been a mistake once economic conditions normalize. The classic example is building too much capacity in some sector, because demand seems strong and growing, only to discover when the boom ends that there's far more capacity than actual sustainable demand can support. Think about the dot-com era. Telecommunications companies invested hundreds of billions of dollars laying fiber optic cable to handle what they expected would be exponentially growing internet traffic. The investment was based on projections that extended the rapid growth rates of the late 90s far into the future. But while internet traffic did grow substantially, it didn't grow as fast as the most optimistic projections, and pricing fell as capacity outstripped demand. Much of the investment in fiber optic networks turned out to be malinvestment. The capacity wasn't needed, at least not for many years, and the companies that built it went bankrupt. Or consider the housing boom of the mid-2000s. Homebuilders ramped up construction based on what seemed like insatiable demand for housing. New subdivisions appeared in the exurbs of major cities, often in locations that required long commutes and lacked the employment base to support permanent residents. When the boom ended and demand evaporated, these developments sat partially completed, monuments to malinvestment. The resources that went into building them, the materials, the labour, the capital, had been consumed without creating lasting value. Malinvestment is particularly insidious because it seems rational at the time. The builders of fibre optic networks and housing subdivisions weren't fools. They were responding to market signals that suggested demand would continue to grow. The problem is that boom-time market signals are distorted by speculation, leverage, and over-optimism. Prices and demand levels that seemed sustainable during the boom proved to have been temporary phenomena. The Austrian School of Economics, particularly the work of Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, emphasized the role of malinvestment in business cycles. They argued that when central banks keep interest rates too low for too long, they create false signals that lead entrepreneurs to undertake investments that aren't justified by genuine consumer preferences. When the artificial stimulus is removed, these malinvestments are revealed as mistakes that must be liquidated. The bust, in this view, is the necessary correction of the errors made during the boom. Warning signs do appear during late-stage booms, though they're often ignored or rationalized away at the time. One common warning sign is the inversion of the yield curve. Normally, long-term interest rates are higher than short-term rates. Lenders demand higher returns for tying up their money for longer periods. But sometimes this relationship inverts, with short-term rates rising above long-term rates. This typically happens when the central bank is raising short-term rates to cool an overheating economy, but bond markets expect that this tightening will eventually cause a recession and lower future interest rates. Yield curve inversions have preceded most recent recessions in the United States, typically by 12 to 18 months. They're not perfect predictors. There have been false signals and the timing is imprecise, but they reflect the bond market's collective judgment that current economic strength is unsustainable and that a downturn is coming. Other warning signs include rapid credit growth, rising debt-to-income ratios, surging asset prices, narrowing risk premiums, and declining lending standards. During the housing boom, for instance, the proliferation of subprime mortgages, stated income loans, and mortgages requiring no down payment were clear signs that lending standards had deteriorated. The creation of increasingly complex financial instruments that few people fully understood was another red flag. The fact that housing prices in many markets had doubled or tripled in just a few years, with no corresponding increase in incomes or rents, was another obvious sign of unsustainability. But here's the paradox. Even when these warning signs are visible, even when thoughtful observers are raising concerns, the boom typically continues for months or years longer. This happens partly because timing is so difficult. Someone who warns that stocks are overvalued when they're at 15 times earnings looks foolish when they rise to 20 times earnings, then 25, then 30. The market can remain irrational longer than skeptics can remain solvent, as the economist John Maynard Keynes famously observed. The fundamental tension is this: the longer and stronger the boom, the larger the imbalances that build up, and the more fragile the economy becomes. But attempting to cool the economy too early or too aggressively risks ending an expansion that could have continued, causing unnecessary unemployment and hardship. Central bankers are always operating with imperfect information, trying to navigate between the risk of letting the boom go too far and the risk of ending it prematurely. Sometimes external shocks play a role in ending booms, though these shocks typically wouldn't be sufficient to cause a recession if the economy weren't already fragile from boom time excesses. The oil price spikes of the 1970s triggered recessions, but in an economy less dependent on oil or more able to absorb price increases, the same shocks might have caused only temporary disruptions. The September 11th attacks in 2001 deepened a recession that had already begun. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 caused a unique and sudden recession, though even there the severity was partly related to the debt levels and fragility that had developed during the preceding expansion. The psychology of late booms is fascinating and crucial. There's a collective delusion that takes hold, a shared belief that the good times will continue indefinitely. This isn't stupidity or ignorance. Many of the participants are highly intelligent, well-educated, and have access to all the relevant information, but they collectively construct a narrative that justifies current conditions and extrapolates them into the future. Part of this is simple recency bias, the tendency to assume that the recent past is a good guide to the future. If housing prices have been rising steadily for 5 years, it becomes natural to assume they'll keep rising. If the stock market has delivered strong returns for a decade, projecting similar returns for the next decade seems reasonable. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, and the most available pattern is the recent one. Another factor is confirmation bias. We preferentially notice and remember information that confirms our existing beliefs, while discounting information that contradicts them. During a boom, when you believe prosperity will continue, you notice the positive economic news and dismiss the negative news as aberrations or the complaints of pessimists. You seek out analysis that confirms your optimism and avoid or reject analysis that suggests caution. Social proof and herding behavior also play crucial roles. Humans are social animals. We take cues from those around us about what's normal and appropriate. When everyone you know is investing in the stock market or buying real estate, when casual social conversations turn to investment returns and property values, when media coverage treats participation in the boom as obviously smart and abstention as obviously foolish, it becomes extremely difficult to maintain a contrary view. The fear of missing out is a powerful emotion. Watching others get wealthy while you sit on the sidelines is psychologically painful. There's also a kind of safety in numbers. If everyone is doing it, it can't be that risky, can it? The collective behavior feels validating. If you have doubts, well, clearly you're wrong because all these other smart people are participating. This collective psychology is self-reinforcing up to a point. Optimism drives behavior that justifies optimism. People spend more because they feel wealthier, which creates economic activity that makes people wealthier, which justifies more spending. Companies invest based on optimistic projections, which creates jobs and income that make the projections more likely to come true. The narrative and the reality reinforce each other in a positive feedback loop, but eventually, the gap between narrative and underlying reality becomes too large to sustain. Debt levels reach points where borrowers can't take on more debt even if they want to. Asset prices reach levels where even optimistic scenarios can't justify further increases. The flow of new participants slows as saturation is reached. Eventually, everyone who can be convinced to buy stocks or real estate has already bought. The male investments start to become visible as projects fail or capacity sits idle. At some point, something gives. Sometimes it's a specific event, a major company bankruptcy, a policy change, a disappointing economic report. But often there's no single identifiable trigger. The psychology simply shifts. Confidence begins to crack. Optimism starts to give way to uncertainty. The mood changes from quote 4 to quote 5. The peak has been reached, though it will only be recognized as such in retrospect. What happens next, how confidence evaporates and boom turns to bust, is a process we'll explore as we continue. But rest here now with this understanding of how booms contain their own undoing. See how natural it is, how inevitable, how the very mechanisms that create prosperity when operating in moderation become destructive when taken to extremes. There's a wisdom in this understanding, a recognition that excess always plants the seeds of reversal, that what seems strongest is often most fragile, that the moment of greatest confidence is often the moment closest to collapse. Let these thoughts settle gently as you settle into deeper relaxation. The cycles continue their eternal rhythm, expansion giving way to contraction, boom containing the seeds of bust. Understanding this doesn't make it less painful for those who experience it, but it does provide perspective, a sense of the larger patterns within which individual experiences unfold. Rest now, knowing that you understand how prosperity can become its own undoing, how success can create the conditions for failure, how the economy breathes in and must eventually breathe out. Let that understanding bring a kind of peace as you drift towards sleep. We've been exploring how economic booms carry within themselves the seeds of their own destruction, how debt accumulates and fragility builds, how asset prices detach from fundamentals, how optimism becomes overconfidence. We've seen the warning signs that appear during late expansions, yield curve inversions, deteriorating lending standards, surging asset prices, and how these signs are typically ignored or rationalized away. Now we need to turn to something more difficult, more unsettling. The moment when confidence finally breaks, when the boom gives way to bust, when the music stops and there aren't enough chairs for everyone. Let's approach this carefully and calmly, because crashes and panics are frightening events even in historical retrospect, even when we know how they ended. But understanding them is essential to understanding economic cycles, and understanding can provide a kind of emotional distance, a way of seeing pattern rather than just chaos. The thing about crashes is that they rarely announce themselves clearly. There's usually no single moment when you can point and say, this is when the boom ended and the bust began. Instead, there's often a period of uncertainty, of mixed signals, of back and forth movement that only later resolves into a clear downturn. The peak is visible only in the rearview mirror. Sometimes the trigger is obvious, a major company failure, a geopolitical shock, a policy announcement. The bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers in September of 2008 was such a trigger. Lehman was a venerable investment bank with over 150 years of history. Its collapse sent shockwaves through the global financial system and marked the point when the financial crisis, which had been building for over a year, entered its acute phase. That was a clear trigger, a definitive moment when everything changed. but other times the trigger is more subtle or even absent entirely. The market simply runs out of new buyers. Prices stop rising. The momentum that had seemed unstoppable simply stops. When prices stop rising, the psychology changes. People who bought assets expecting them to appreciate find themselves holding assets that aren't appreciating. The reason to buy, the expectation of price increases, no longer exists, so they stop buying. Some start selling. Prices begin to fall. These initial price declines are often modest. The stock market dips a few percentage points. Housing prices in a particular market soften slightly. These small declines might not seem significant. Markets fluctuate all the time. Small corrections are normal and even healthy. But in a market that has been driven by momentum and speculation, where many participants are leveraged and where confidence is fragile, even small declines can trigger much larger moves. Here's where leverage becomes crucial. Remember that during the boom, many participants borrowed money to amplify their returns. They might have put down 10% of their own money and borrowed 90% to buy stocks or real estate or other assets. As long as prices were rising, this worked beautifully. A 10% increase in asset prices meant a 100% return on their invested capital, minus borrowing costs. But leverage works symmetrically. A 10% decline in asset prices wipes out 100% of their invested capital. Suddenly they've lost all their own money and still owe the borrowed amount. This is when margin calls occur. Margin calls are demands from lenders that borrowers either deposit more cash to cover their losses or sell their positions to repay the loans. Borrowers who receive margin calls face difficult choices. They can deposit more cash if they have it, but many don't. They've already invested most of their available capital. They can sell other assets to raise cash. But this means realizing losses on those assets as well, or they can simply allow their positions to be liquidated by the lender. Most choose or are forced into the third option. The lender sells the assets to recover the loan. When many leveraged investors face margin calls simultaneously, which typically happens when prices fall across the board, the selling pressure becomes intense. The forced selling drives prices lower, which triggers more margin calls, which creates more forced selling, which drives prices even lower. This is a self-reinforcing spiral, a feedback loop running in reverse from the positive feedback loops that drove prices higher during the boom. The psychology of this moment is crucial. During the boom, investors felt smart, successful, vindicated. They saw their portfolios growing. They perhaps received praise from friends and family for their investment acumen. But as prices start falling and losses mount, that confidence evaporates. It's replaced by fear, by regret, by a desperate desire to limit losses and preserve whatever capital remains. This psychological shift affects behavior in powerful ways. People who were eager to buy more when prices were rising become desperate to sell when prices are falling. The same social dynamics that created herding behavior on the way up create it on the way down. If your neighbors are selling, if your colleagues are worried, if media coverage shifts from celebration to alarm, your own anxiety intensifies. The fear of losing everything becomes as powerful as the earlier fear of missing out. Panic is a strong word, but it accurately describes what often happens in severe crashes. Panic isn't rational calculation of self-interest. It's an emotional state where fear overwhelms deliberation. People sell not because they've carefully analysed their positions and determined that selling is the optimal strategy, but because they can't bear the uncertainty and fear. They sell to regain some sense of control, even if selling locks in losses that might have been temporary. The financial markets during a crash take on a quality of chaos that's difficult to convey to those who haven't experienced it. Prices gyrate wildly. Trading volumes spike to levels that overwhelm the systems designed to handle them. In modern electronic markets, circuit breakers, automatic halts to trading when prices fall too far too fast, get triggered. In the old days of open outcry trading floors, The scene was one of shouting, running, physical chaos as traders tried to execute orders faster than systems could process them. The crash of 1929 provides a historical example of how this unfolds. Black Thursday, October 24th, saw unprecedented selling pressure from the opening bell. By mid-morning, panic had set in. The ticker tape machines that printed out stock prices fell hopelessly behind. They were showing prices from hours earlier, leaving investors blind about current values. This information vacuum intensified the panic. People didn't know what their holdings were worth, so they sold desperately, willing to accept almost any price just to get out. Similar scenes played out in October 1987, when the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell by more than 22% in a single day, still the largest one-day percentage decline in history. The crash occurred across global markets, following the sun westward as markets opened in each time zone. The triggers were complex: rising interest rates, computerized trading programs, portfolio insurance strategies that created automatic selling pressure. But the result was pure panic. More recently, the flash crash of May 6, 2010, showed how modern computerized trading can amplify volatility. In a matter of minutes, major stock indices fell nearly 10% before recovering almost as quickly. Individual stocks saw prices fall to pennies or spike to absurd levels. The crash was triggered by a combination of high-frequency trading algorithms and a large sell order in futures markets, but it demonstrated the fragility of modern market infrastructure. But crashes aren't just about stock markets. They can occur in any market where leverage and speculation have created fragility. Real estate markets crash too, though usually more slowly than stock markets because real estate is less liquid. You can't sell a house as quickly as you can sell a stock. The housing market crash that began in 2006 and accelerated through 2008 saw home prices in some markets fall by 50% or more from their peaks. Homeowners found themselves underwater, owing more on their mortgages than their homes were worth. Credit markets can crash as well. In what's called a credit freeze or credit crunch, this is when lenders become so worried about the risk of default that they stop lending altogether, even to credit-worthy borrowers. During the 2008 financial crisis, the credit markets essentially froze. Banks refused to lend to each other because they didn't trust that borrowers could repay. The interest rates that banks charge each other for overnight loans, normally just slightly above what they can earn from the central bank, spiked to unprecedented levels. Companies that relied on rolling over short-term debt to fund operations suddenly couldn't borrow. The machinery of credit that had operated smoothly for years simply stopped working. This credit freeze is particularly dangerous because modern economies run on credit. Businesses use short-term credit to manage cash flow, to pay suppliers before customers have paid them, to maintain inventory, to make payroll. When this credit disappears, even healthy companies with solid business models can fail, simply because they can't access the cash they need to operate. It's like a human body experiencing cardiac arrest. The heart stops pumping blood, and even if all the organs are healthy, they'll fail without the blood flow they need. The concept of contagion is important for understanding how crashes spread. Financial systems are interconnected. Banks lend to each other. They have complex webs of obligations and counterparty relationships. When one institution fails, others that had exposure to it suffer losses. Those losses can be large enough to threaten the solvency of institutions that seemed healthy. As more institutions face trouble, fear spreads, and everyone becomes more cautious. This contagion can cross borders. In our globalized financial system, banks and investors in different countries hold each other's debt and equity. A crisis that begins in one country's housing market, like the subprime mortgage crisis in the United States, can spread to European banks that bought mortgage-backed securities. Those European banks' problems can then affect Asian institutions that had exposure to European debt. The interconnections that made the system seem robust during good times become channels for spreading distress during bad times. There's also a distinction worth understanding between liquidity crises and solvency crises, though in practice they often blur together. A liquidity crisis occurs when an institution or individual has sufficient assets to cover obligations, but can't convert those assets to cash quickly enough to meet immediate demands. Imagine a person who owns a house worth $300,000 but needs $20,000 to cover an unexpected expense. They're solvent, their assets exceed their liabilities, but they lack liquidity because they can't sell the house quickly. A solvency crisis occurs when liabilities genuinely exceed assets, when the institution or individual is truly broke even if they could liquidate everything at fair prices. During crashes, it's often hard to tell the difference. An institution that appears to have a liquidity problem, they have assets but can't sell them quickly, might actually have a solvency problem if the market prices of their assets have fallen far enough, and the uncertainty about which problem a struggling institution faces makes everyone more fearful and less willing to lend, turning liquidity problems into solvency problems. The economist George Soros developed the concept of reflexivity to describe how market perceptions can create the reality they anticipate. In financial markets, participants' beliefs affect their behavior, which affects market outcomes, which in turn affects their beliefs. During a boom, the belief that prices will rise leads people to buy, which pushes prices higher, which confirms the belief and encourages more buying. The reverse happens during crashes. The belief that prices will fall leads people to sell, which pushes prices lower, which confirms the belief and encourages more selling. This reflexivity means that market prices during crashes don't necessarily reflect any rational assessment of fundamental value. They reflect fear, forced selling, and self-fulfilling pessimism. Assets get sold not because they're worthless, but because holders need to raise cash or cut losses. Prices fall to levels that make no sense based on the underlying earnings or cash flows or utility the assets provide. But while the prices are falling, those low prices feel justified because everything is falling and the mood is one of catastrophe. The paradox of thrift becomes visible during crashes. This concept, articulated by John Maynard Keynes, describes how individual rationality can lead to collective irrationality. When people become worried about their financial situation, the rational response is to save more and spend less. But when everyone tries to save simultaneously, the resulting decline in spending causes incomes to fall, which makes everyone poorer and validates the worry that led to increased saving in the first place. The same paradox applies to debt reduction. When people are worried about their debt levels, the rational response is to pay down debt to deleverage. But when everyone tries to deleverage simultaneously, the decline in spending depresses economic activity, which makes it harder to earn the income needed to pay down debt. The attempt to become safer individually makes everyone more vulnerable collectively. Fire sales are another feature of crashes that amplifies the downward spiral. A fire sale occurs when assets must be sold urgently regardless of price, like selling goods from a burning building where saving anything is better than losing everything. During financial crashes, institutions facing liquidity crises or margin calls engage in fire sales, selling whatever they can sell quickly to raise cash. But fire sales depress market prices. When a forced seller dumps large quantities of assets on the market, prices fall because there aren't enough buyers willing to absorb the supply at current prices. These depressed prices then become the new market reference point. Other holders of similar assets see their portfolio values decline based on the fire sale prices, even if they're not selling. This can trigger margin calls or solvency concerns for them, leading to more fire sales, further price declines, and so on. The breakdown of price discovery is a subtle but crucial aspect of crashes. In normal markets, prices aggregate information from many participants with different views, needs, and time horizons. The resulting price reflects a kind of collective wisdom about value. But during crashes, The only participants actively trading are forced sellers and vulture buyers, hoping to profit from distress. The resulting prices don't reflect anything like fundamental value. They reflect desperation and dysfunction. This creates opportunities for investors with cash and courage. Warren Buffett's famous advice to be greedy when others are fearful applies here. Assets that will produce solid returns over the long term can be bought at fire sale prices during crashes. But taking advantage of these opportunities requires the psychological strength to buy when everything is falling and everyone else is selling, which very few people can manage. The role of uncertainty during crashes cannot be overstated. What makes crashes so psychologically difficult is not just that prices are falling, but that no one knows how far they'll fall or when the decline will end. During the Great Depression, the stock market fell for nearly 3 years, bottoming in 1932 at levels 90% below the 1929 peak. Anyone who bought thinking they were getting a bargain in 1930 or 1931 watched their investment lose even more value. This uncertainty paralyzes decision-making. Should you sell now to limit losses or hold on hoping for recovery? Should you buy what seem like bargains or wait for prices to fall further? There's no clear right answer, and the consequences of being wrong are severe. This uncertainty, this inability to know what will happen or when the nightmare will end, is perhaps the most psychologically taxing aspect of crashes. Media coverage during crashes typically amplifies fear and uncertainty. The same media outlets that celebrated the boom now document the bust with alarming headlines and dire predictions. Stories focus on losses, on failures, on hardship. While this reflects reality, it also contributes to the collective mood of panic and pessimism. The constant stream of bad news makes it hard to maintain perspective or imagine that recovery will eventually come. There's also often a search for villains during and after crashes. People want someone to blame for their losses and for the broader economic damage. Sometimes there are genuinely bad actors, fraudsters like Bernie Madoff whose schemes unravel during crashes, or executives who took reckless risks with other people's money. But often the search for villains is misplaced. The crash results not from villainy, but from collective behavior, from the accumulated effect of millions of individual decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. The speed of crashes varies, but tends to be faster than the speed of booms. Years of gradual price increases can be wiped out in weeks or months. This asymmetry reflects a fundamental difference in psychology. Fear is a more powerful and urgent emotion than greed. The desire to avoid losses motivates more intense action than the desire to achieve gains. When things are falling apart, people act urgently to protect themselves. When things are going well, people are more patient, more willing to let gains accumulate slowly. Circuit breakers and trading halts in modern markets are designed to slow the pace of crashes, to give participants time to catch their breath and assess the situation more calmly. After the 1987 crash, markets implemented rules that automatically halt trading if prices fall by certain thresholds. The idea is to prevent the kind of cascading panic that can occur when prices are in free fall. These mechanisms help at the margin, but they can't prevent crashes entirely. If selling pressure is genuine and widespread, halting trading just delays the inevitable. When trading resumes, the selling continues. Some argue that circuit breakers might even make things worse by preventing prices from finding their natural level, leaving participants in suspense about where things will settle. The crash itself is a kind of violent reversion to reality. All the excesses of the boom, the excessive debt, the inflated asset prices, the malinvestments, are being corrected, but in a compressed and painful time frame. What accumulated gradually over years must be unwound rapidly over weeks or months. The adjustment that could have happened slowly and moderately through earlier policy action, or more prudent behaviour, now happens suddenly and catastrophically. But here's something important to understand. Crashes end, always. At some point the selling exhausts itself. Prices fall far enough that value-oriented buyers start to appear. The most leveraged and vulnerable participants have already been forced out. Those who remain are more stable, less likely to panic sell. Uncertainty begins to resolve, perhaps through government action, perhaps through the passage of time, perhaps simply through the exhaustion of fear. Let's move carefully into this territory, because recessions are where economic abstractions become human suffering, where job losses and business failures and financial hardship touch millions of lives. But let's also remember that recessions, like crashes, are temporary. They end. Recovery follows. The cycle continues. Holding both truths together, the reality of suffering and the certainty of eventual recovery, can help us understand this phase with both honesty and perspective. The transition from financial crash to economic recession isn't always immediate or obvious. Sometimes the financial crisis and the recession are nearly simultaneous, as in 2008 when the banking crisis and the broader economic downturn reinforced each other in a catastrophic feedback loop. But other times there's a lag. The stock market crashes, wealth evaporates, credit tightens, and then over the following months these financial disruptions work their way through to the real economy of jobs and production and spending. Think about how this transmission occurs. When stock prices fall, people who own stocks feel poorer. The wealth effect that supported consumer spending during the boom now operates in reverse. Someone who was comfortable spending freely when their retirement account was growing by $50,000 a year becomes cautious when that same account has shrunk by $100,000. They cut back on discretionary purchases, the vacation they were planning, the car they were thinking about replacing, the home renovation they were considering. This reduced spending means reduced income for the businesses that would have provided those goods and services. When credit markets freeze, as they did dramatically in 2008, businesses that rely on credit to manage their operations face immediate problems. A manufacturer might need a line of credit to buy raw materials to fill orders, planning to pay back the loan when customers pay for the finished goods. If that credit suddenly becomes unavailable, the manufacturer can't fill orders even though they have customers and workers ready. Orders go unfilled. Revenue falls. Workers get laid off. The credit freeze translates directly into job losses. Housing market crashes create their own channels of economic damage. Construction employment falls sharply. If new homes aren't being built and existing homes aren't being renovated, construction workers lose their jobs. Industries that supply construction, lumber mills, appliance manufacturers, furniture makers, see demand plummet. Real estate agents, mortgage brokers, title companies and others in housing-related services see their incomes collapse. The ripple effects spread through communities, especially those that had seen housing booms and construction employment surge. For homeowners who are underwater, owing more on their mortgages than their homes are worth, the psychological and financial effects are profound. They can't sell without taking a loss larger than their savings. They feel trapped. Many stop making mortgage payments, either because they can't afford them as household income falls, or because they make a strategic decision that it doesn't make sense to keep paying on an asset worth far less than the debt. Foreclosures rise. Neighborhoods fill with vacant homes, which depresses prices further and creates blight. Job losses are the most visible and painful manifestation of recession. When businesses see demand for their products or services decline, they adjust by cutting production. Initially, they might reduce hours or freeze hiring or reduce temporary workers. But if the downturn deepens or persists, they lay off permanent employees. These layoffs happen in waves, spreading through industries and regions as the contraction deepens. Young people entering the labour market during recessions face particular difficulties. Graduating into a recession can have lasting effects on career trajectories and lifetime earnings. The entry-level jobs that would normally provide early career experience aren't available. Young workers take jobs for which they're overqualified, or they return to school to wait out the recession, or they piece together temporary and part-time work. Research has shown that people who enter the labour market during recessions earn less, for decades afterward compared to similar people who graduated during expansions. For businesses, recessions are a time of struggle and often failure. Declining revenue forces difficult decisions. Companies cut costs wherever they can, reducing hours, freezing wages, cancelling expansion plans, cutting marketing and research budgets. But if revenue falls sharply enough, even aggressive cost-cutting isn't sufficient. Companies that were viable during the boom find they can't survive the bust. They close their doors, their workers lose jobs, their creditors lose money, their communities lose employers and tax base. Small businesses are particularly vulnerable during recessions. They typically have less access to credit than large corporations. They have smaller financial cushions to absorb revenue declines. A restaurant that saw its customer count fall by 30% during the boom might easily survive. But a 30% decline during a recession, when costs can't be cut proportionally and credit isn't available to cover shortfalls, can be fatal. The failure of small businesses is particularly painful for communities because these businesses are often deeply embedded in local social fabric. The retail sector typically suffers severely during recessions as consumer spending contracts. Stores that were thriving with multiple locations, close branches, or shut down entirely. Shopping malls that were full during the boom develop vacancies. The landscape changes visibly. Empty storefronts, going out of business sales, liquidations. These visible signs of economic distress reinforce the general mood of pessimism and make people even more cautious about spending. Manufacturing often sees sharp contractions during recessions. When consumer and business spending falls, demand for manufactured goods falls even more sharply because some spending can be postponed. People keep driving their old cars longer rather than buying new ones. Businesses delay replacing equipment. The reduction in final demand means factories cut production. In severe recessions, capacity utilization, the percentage of manufacturing capacity actually being used, can fall to 70% or even lower, meaning nearly a third of productive capacity sits idle. The feedback loops during recessions all run in the wrong direction. Job losses reduce income, which reduces spending, which reduces business revenue, which causes more job losses. Falling asset prices reduce wealth, which reduces spending, which weakens the economy, which causes asset prices to fall further. Fear causes people to save rather than spend. But the reduced spending validates the fear and makes everyone poorer. Breaking these negative feedback loops is extraordinarily difficult. The response of central banks to recessions has evolved considerably over the decades. The modern playbook, refined through experience and informed by research on past recessions and especially the Great Depression, involves aggressive monetary easing. Central banks cut interest rates, typically to near zero. They communicate that rates will stay low for an extended period. And in severe recessions, they employ unconventional tools like quantitative easing, purchasing government bonds and other assets to inject money into the economy and lower long-term interest rates. These monetary policy actions are designed to encourage borrowing and spending. Lower interest rates make mortgages cheaper, auto loans more affordable, business borrowing more attractive. They also tend to boost stock prices and other asset values, creating positive wealth effects. The hope is that these channels will stimulate demand enough to arrest the contraction and set the stage for recovery. But monetary policy during recessions faces a fundamental problem. You can make credit cheap and available, but you can't force people to borrow if they don't want to. If households are focused on paying down debt, if businesses are pessimistic about future demand, lowering interest rates might have little effect. This is sometimes called pushing on a string. The central bank can push liquidity into the banking system, but it can't make people borrow and spend. Fiscal policy, government spending and taxation, becomes crucial during severe recessions. Government can directly create demand through spending on infrastructure, education, defense, or other programs. It can cut taxes to leave more money in private hands. These fiscal stimulus measures are designed to offset the decline in private spending with increased public spending, preventing the contraction from becoming too severe or prolonged. The effectiveness of fiscal stimulus during recessions is contested along ideological lines. Keynesian economists argue that government spending is essential during recessions to break the negative feedback loops and support demand while the private sector heals. More conservative economists worry about the debt implications and question whether government spending is as productive as private spending. But most economists agree that some fiscal response is appropriate during severe recessions, even if they disagree about the optimal size and composition. The 2008 financial crisis and subsequent Great Recession saw unprecedented coordination of monetary and fiscal policy. Central banks around the world cut rates to near zero and implemented quantitative easing. Governments enacted fiscal stimulus packages. The United States passed a $787 billion stimulus package in early 2009. The aggressive policy response probably prevented the recession from becoming another Great Depression, though it still resulted in the worst economic contraction since the 1930s. Different recessions have different characters and causes. Some are triggered by financial crises, like the Great Recession. Some result from oil price shocks, like the recessions of the 1970s. Some follow the bursting of asset bubbles. Some are caused by monetary policy tightening intended to combat inflation. The causes matter for both the severity of the recession and the appropriate policy response. But recessions do end. The contraction eventually exhausts itself. The most vulnerable businesses have already failed. The most leveraged households have already defaulted. Those who remain are more stable. The process of deleveraging, while painful, gradually restores balance sheets to more sustainable levels. Lower debt means less of future income must go to debt service, leaving more available for spending. Asset prices eventually find levels that attract buyers. Slowly, tentatively, confidence begins to return. Sometimes recovery is sparked by policy action, fiscal stimulus that directly creates demand, monetary easing that makes credit more available, reforms that address the causes of the crisis. Sometimes recovery simply emerges from the passage of time and the natural recuperative powers of the economy. Needs that were deferred during the recession eventually must be met. Cars wear out and must be replaced. Housing construction eventually must resume as the population grows. The trough, the lowest point of the recession, is rarely recognized at the time. It feels like just another bad month in a long series of bad months. Only in retrospect, when several months of growth have been recorded, does it become clear that the bottom was reached and recovery has begun. This is frustrating for people living through it, who desperately want to know when things will get better, but have no clear signal. As recovery begins, it's typically tentative and fragile. Growth might be positive but weak. Unemployment might stop rising but remain elevated. People remain cautious, unsure whether the improvement will last or prove to be a false dawn. This caution is understandable. Recessions often include periods of apparent stabilization that prove temporary, followed by renewed deterioration. Only sustained improvement over many months rebuilds confidence that recovery is real. The length of time it takes for unemployment to return to pre-recession levels varies, but is typically measured in years rather than months. After the Great Recession, it took nearly 6 years for unemployment to return to pre-crisis levels. During that time, millions of people experienced prolonged joblessness, underemployment, and financial stress. The personal toll of these years, lost income, depleted savings, damaged credit, disrupted careers, can never be fully recovered. The lessons of recessions are both economic and psychological. Economically, recessions teach the importance of maintaining buffers, savings, manageable debt levels, diversified income sources. They teach that boom-time prosperity can evaporate quickly, and that planning for downturns is prudent. Psychologically, recessions teach humility about our ability to control economic outcomes, empathy for those who suffer through no fault of their own, and the value of community and mutual support. Recessions also reveal the limitations of purely individual solutions to systemic problems. When unemployment is high because of broad economic conditions, no amount of individual effort or merit can create jobs that don't exist. This reality often leads to increased political support for collective action, for unemployment insurance, for fiscal stimulus, for government programs to address shared hardship. Recessions can thus shift political and social attitudes about the role of government and the nature of economic responsibility. As we continue our journey through economic cycles, we'll explore why these patterns repeat roughly every 10 years and what distinguishes different types of cycles. But rest here now with an understanding of recessions, how they unfold, how they affect people's lives, how policy responds, how they eventually give way to recovery. The recessions we've discussed are history, safely in the past. The suffering was real, but so was the eventual recovery. The cycle continued, as it always does. Let yourself drift now if you feel sleepy. The recession phase we've explored, difficult as it is temporary, finite, survivable. Understanding this doesn't eliminate the pain for those who experience it, but it provides perspective, a sense of the larger pattern. Rest in the knowledge that recessions end, that recovery follows contraction as surely as expansion follows trough. Let that understanding bring peace as you settle deeper into rest. Breathe slowly, release your cares. The cycles continue their rhythm, but you are safe here, comfortable, at peace. Sleep well. We've travelled through the anatomy of recession, through job losses and business failures and the slow, painful process of contraction and eventual recovery. We've seen how crashes quickly give way to recessions that can last for years, touching millions of lives with hardship that eventually, inevitably gives way to renewed growth. Now we need to examine something curious, something that has puzzled economists and fascinated observers for generations: the peculiar regularity of these cycles, the way they seem to repeat with remarkable consistency roughly every 10 years. Let's be clear from the outset. Economic cycles don't follow a precise schedule. They're not mechanical, not predictable down to the month or even the year. The economy is not a metronome ticking away with perfect regularity. But when we step back and look at the historical record, a pattern emerges that's too consistent to be mere coincidence. Expansions tend to last somewhere between 5 and 12 years. Recessions punctuate these expansions with surprising regularity. The average time from one recession to the next, measured peak to peak, clusters around 8 to 11 years, with 10 being a rough average. Why 10 years? Why not 5, or 15, or 20? What is it about a decade that seems to be the natural lifespan of an economic expansion? These are deep questions without simple answers, but exploring them takes us to the heart of how economies and human psychology interact to create the rhythmic patterns we've been examining. Let's start by looking at the historical record, because seeing the pattern laid out in chronological detail makes it more real, more tangible than abstract discussion. In the United States since World War II, we can trace a remarkably consistent pattern of expansions and recessions. This post-war period is useful to examine because the economy has been more stable, more managed by monetary and fiscal policy, more modern in structure than earlier periods. If cycles were simply artifacts of primitive economies or poor policy, they should have disappeared in this modern era, but they haven't. In 1945, World War II ended, and the economy began transitioning from wartime production to peacetime. There was a brief recession in 1945 as military spending collapsed, then a strong expansion through the late 40s. This expansion ended with a recession in 1949. The time from the end of the 1945 recession to the start of the 1949 recession was about 4 years, relatively short by post-war standards. Recovery from the 1949 recession was followed by expansion through the early 50s, supported by spending on the Korean War. But this expansion ended with recession in 1953. Again, a relatively short cycle, about 4 years from the previous recession. The 1953 recession was followed by a strong mid-50s expansion that ended with another recession in 1958. 5 years this time. The pattern continues. The 1950s gave way to the 1960s, a decade that would see the longest expansion of the post-war period up to that time. From the 1961 trough following the 1960 recession until the 1969 peak, the economy expanded for more than 8 years, supported by fiscal stimulus, the Vietnam War build-up, and demographic factors as baby boomers entered adulthood. But this long expansion ended with recession in 1969 to 1970. The 1970s were tumultuous, marked by oil price shocks and high inflation. There was recession in 1973 to 1975, triggered partly by the Arab oil embargo and resulting energy crisis. This was followed by a modest expansion that ended with recession in 1980. Then, after a very brief recovery, another recession in 1981 to 1982. The double-dip recessions of the early 80s were caused partly by the Federal Reserve's aggressive interest rate increases to combat the double-digit inflation that had plagued the 70s. The recovery from the 1982 recession began what would become a historically long expansion through the rest of the 80s. But even this expansion, which saw the stock market boom and the economy transform, eventually ended with recession in 1990 to 1991, 8 years from the previous recession to this one, right in the expected range. The 90s expansion that followed the 1991 recession would become even longer than the 80s expansion, lasting a full 10 years until the economy peaked in 2001. This expansion encompassed the technology boom, the rise of the internet, and a period called the Great Moderation, when it seemed like economists and policymakers had figured out how to minimize economic volatility. But the expansion still ended, giving way to a relatively mild recession in 2001, following the dot-com bubble burst and the September 11th attacks. The recovery from the 2001 recession led to the mid-2000s expansion, characterized by a massive housing bubble and financial sector growth. This expansion lasted 6 years, ending with the Great Recession that began in December of 2007. The Great Recession was the most severe downturn since the Great Depression, lasting 18 months and requiring unprecedented policy intervention. The recovery from the Great Recession began in June of 2009 and would become the longest expansion in recorded American history, lasting until February of 2020, nearly 11 years. This expansion finally ended not because of internal imbalances reaching breaking points, but because of the exogenous shock of the COVID-19 pandemic, which forced a sudden, sharp, government-mandated shutdown of much economic activity. Look at this chronology and the pattern is clear. Recessions occur with remarkable regularity. The specific timing varies. Some expansions last 4 years, others 10 or 11. But the general pattern of an expansion lasting somewhere in the range of 5 to 10 years, punctuated by recession, then a new expansion beginning, repeats over and over. The 10-year cycle isn't a rigid law, but it's a powerful empirical regularity. This pattern isn't unique to the United States. Other advanced economies show similar cyclical patterns, though the specific timing doesn't always align. Sometimes recessions are global, affecting most economies simultaneously, as in 2008. Other times they're more country-specific. But the rough 10-year rhythm appears across different countries and different economic structures. So why does this happen? What is it about 10 years that represents some kind of natural cycle length? The answer lies in several interconnected factors. The time it takes for debt to accumulate to unsustainable levels, the gradual fading of memory, the life cycle of regulatory tightening and loosening, and perhaps something deeper about human psychology and institutional behavior. Let's think about debt accumulation first. As we've discussed, expansions are characterized by rising debt levels as households, and businesses borrow to finance spending and investment. In the early stages of expansion, this borrowing is productive and sustainable, but as expansion continues, debt accumulates faster than income. Debt-to-income ratios rise. The share of income that must go to servicing debt increases. The system becomes progressively more fragile. How long does this process take? It depends on many factors, but empirically it seems to take somewhere in the range of 5 to 10 years for debt levels to rise from sustainable to problematic. In the early years of expansion, there's plenty of room for debt to grow safely. After 5 or 6 or 7 years, less room. After 8 or 9 or 10 years, debt levels are often stretched enough that the system has become fragile and vulnerable to shocks. This isn't a mechanical process with a fixed timeline. Sometimes it happens faster, if credit standards loosen quickly, if asset bubbles inflate rapidly. Sometimes it happens slower, if the expansion is initially modest, if regulators maintain tight standards, if past experience creates caution. But the general time frame of roughly a decade for debt to accumulate to dangerous levels appears with remarkable consistency. Memory plays a crucial role in cycle dynamics, and memory has a temporal dimension that may help explain the 10-year pattern. Think about what happens in the immediate aftermath of a recession. People and businesses who lived through the downturn remember the pain vividly. They're cautious about borrowing. They maintain savings buffers. They avoid excessive risk. Banks that suffered losses during the crisis maintain tight lending standards. Regulators who saw the system nearly collapse implement and enforce strict rules. This caution, born of recent painful experience, helps keep the early expansion healthy. Borrowing is moderate. Asset prices rise in line with fundamentals. Speculation is limited. The memory of the previous recession acts as a restraining force, preventing the excessive behaviors that would create fragility. But memory fades. As years pass and the economy continues to expand, the recession recedes into the past. People who were burned during the downturn have now experienced several years of prosperity. The pain has faded. Confidence has returned. New participants enter markets. Young workers who graduated after the recession, new entrepreneurs who didn't experience the previous crisis, investors who only know the expansion. These newcomers don't have the experiential knowledge that creates caution. By the time 7 or 8 or 9 years have passed since the last recession, much of the workforce and many market participants have limited direct experience with downturn. The recession is something that happened in the past, not a vivid present memory. The lessons learned during the crisis about the dangers of leverage, about the fragility of asset prices, about the risks of speculation, have faded. People fall back into the behaviors that create bubbles and crises. This generational replacement of caution with confidence takes time. It's not instantaneous. But it's also not indefinite. 10 years seems to be roughly the time it takes for the memory of the last crisis to fade enough that the behaviors that caused it can resurface. This is a sobering observation about human nature. We seem incapable of learning from history for more than about a decade. Each generation must learn the lessons of booms and busts through painful experience rather than through transmitted wisdom. Regulatory cycles parallel this memory cycle and may help explain the 10-year pattern. In the immediate aftermath of a financial crisis, there's strong political will to reform the financial system, to prevent the excesses that caused the crisis from recurring. New regulations are enacted. Existing rules are enforced more strictly. Regulators are empowered and funded. The political mood supports aggressive oversight. The years immediately following the Great Depression saw major financial reforms, the creation of the FDIC to insure bank deposits, the Glass-Steagall Act separating commercial and investment banking, the Securities Act regulating stock markets, the creation of the SEC. These reforms fundamentally restructured American finance and helped create decades of relative financial stability. Similarly, after the 2008 crisis, the Dodd-Frank Act imposed new regulations on banks, created new oversight mechanisms, required higher capital levels, and attempted to address the too-big-to-fail problem. These reforms were controversial but represented serious attempts to prevent future crises. But regulatory strictness doesn't last. As the expansion continues and memories fade, the political will for tough regulation erodes. The financial industry lobbies against rules it finds burdensome. Politicians are more receptive to these arguments when the economy is doing well and financial crises seem like distant history. Regulators become more deferential to industry. Rules are relaxed incrementally. Enforcement becomes less aggressive. This regulatory dialectic, tightening after crises, gradual loosening during expansions, operates on a timeline that roughly matches the business cycle. It takes several years of stability for the political consensus supporting strict regulation to break down. By 7 or 8 or 9 years into an expansion, regulations have often been substantially weakened from their post-crisis peak. This weakening contributes to the build-up of fragility that eventually leads to the next crisis. There's also a technical economic concept that may explain some of the cyclicality, the juggler cycle, named after the French economist Clement Juglar, who identified it in the 19th century. Juglar observed business cycles with a period of about 8 to 11 years, and he attributed them to fluctuations in investment spending. His theory was that it takes roughly this long for businesses to build new productive capacity, for that capacity to be absorbed by demand, for shortages to develop that justify new investment, and for the cycle to repeat. In modern terms, we might think of the Juglar cycle as reflecting the time it takes for capital stock to be renewed. Businesses invest in new equipment, new facilities, new technology during expansions. This investment creates demand for the construction workers who build the facilities, for the manufacturers who produce the equipment, for all the supporting industries. But once the investment is complete, that demand goes away. There's a period when the new capacity is being utilized but no new investment is occurring. Eventually equipment ages, technology becomes obsolete, and a new investment cycle begins. This investment cycle doesn't have a rigid timeline, but the process of building capacity, utilizing it, and needing to replace or expand it does have a natural rhythm that tends to play out over roughly a decade. This rhythm may underlie some of the regularity we observe in business cycles. The financial industry itself has a life cycle that may contribute to the 10-year pattern. In the aftermath of a crisis, the industry is chastened. The riskiest firms have failed. Those that survived are more conservative. But as years pass and the industry becomes profitable again, it attracts talent and capital. Aggressive, risk-seeking individuals and firms enter or re-enter. Competition for returns drives increasingly risky behavior. By 7 or 8 or 9 years into an expansion, the industry has typically rebuilt leverage and risk-taking to levels similar to those that preceded the previous crisis. This pattern is sometimes called the Minsky cycle, after Hyman Minsky's financial instability hypothesis that we discussed earlier. Minsky argued that stability breeds instability over time, that successful economic periods create the conditions for crisis. The time frame over which this process unfolds, from post-crisis caution to late expansion risk-taking, seems empirically to be roughly a decade. There may also be something about human psychology and institutional memory that operates on roughly a 10-year cycle. Institutions, banks, corporations, government agencies have personnel turnover, leadership changes. By 10 years after a crisis, many of the people who were in decision-making positions during the crisis have retired or moved on. The new leadership may intellectually understand what happened, but they lack the visceral experience that creates true caution. They're more willing to take risks that the previous generation would have avoided. Similarly, cultural memory within institutions fades over time. The stories that are told, the lessons that are emphasized, the practices that are maintained, all of these erode gradually. What starts as a firm commitment to never repeat past mistakes evolves into an intellectual understanding that certain risks exist, and eventually becomes a vague awareness that something bad happened once, but the details are fuzzy. This institutional forgetting takes time, but 10 years seems to be roughly how long it takes. The coincidence of these various cycles, debt accumulation, memory fading, regulatory loosening, capital stock renewal, institutional turnover, may help explain why economic cycles cluster around a 10-year period. No single factor rigidly determines cycle length, but the convergence of multiple factors, each with its own rough 10-year timeline, creates a powerful tendency towards cycles of roughly this duration. It's worth noting that the 10-year pattern is an average, not a law. Individual cycles vary considerably. The expansion of the 1960s lasted more than 8 years. The expansion of the 1990s lasted a full decade. The expansion following the Great Recession lasted nearly 11 years. But there have also been shorter cycles. The early post-war period saw several cycles of only 4 or 5 years. What we're observing is a central tendency, a clustering around 10 years, not a rigid periodicity. The fact that cycles vary in length but cluster around a central tendency actually makes sense if we think about the multiple factors involved. Different factors have different timelines in different circumstances. Sometimes debt accumulates quickly, sometimes slowly. Sometimes regulatory loosening happens rapidly, sometimes gradually. Sometimes external shocks cut an expansion short before internal imbalances reach critical levels. The variation reflects the complexity of real economies and the multiple factors that influence cycle dynamics. What's perhaps most striking about the 10-year pattern is its persistence, despite enormous changes in economic structure, policy frameworks, and understanding. The economy of the 1950s was vastly different from the economy of the 2010s. Manufacturing was more important. Services less so. International trade was less integrated. Technology was primitive by modern standards, yet cycles persisted. Policy frameworks changed dramatically. Keynesian demand management gave way to monetarism, which evolved into modern inflation targeting. Yet cycles persisted. This persistence suggests that business cycles aren't primarily the result of policy errors or institutional failures, though these can certainly affect cycle severity. Rather, cycles seem to be inherent to how market economies function, emerging from the interaction of human psychology, credit dynamics, and the time it takes for imbalances to build and resolve. The roughly 10-year rhythm appears to reflect something fundamental about these dynamics. Understanding the 10-year pattern has practical implications. For individuals, it suggests the wisdom of maintaining financial buffers and avoiding excessive debt even during good times. If you know that a recession is likely within the next 5 to 10 years, even if you don't know exactly when, you can plan accordingly. Maintaining emergency savings, avoiding over-leveraging, not assuming current conditions will last forever. For policymakers, the pattern suggests both humility and responsibility. Humility because eliminating cycles entirely may be impossible. They seem to emerge from fundamental features of market economies. Responsibility because even if cycles can't be eliminated, their severity can be moderated through appropriate policy. The Great Depression and the Great Recession were both devastating, but aggressive policy response prevented the latter from being as severe as the former. For businesses, understanding cycles means planning for eventual downturn even during booms. Companies that maintain financial flexibility, that don't overextend during good times, that plan for scenarios where demand falls, these companies are better positioned to survive recessions and emerge stronger. The companies that fail during recessions are often those that assumed the boom would last forever and structured themselves accordingly. The 10-year pattern also has implications for how we think about economic progress. It's tempting to measure progress by looking at the peak of one expansion compared to the peak of the previous one. But this ignores the recessions in between, the suffering they cause, the resources they waste. A more complete accounting of progress would consider not just the heights of expansions, but also the depths of recessions and the time spent recovering. There's also a philosophical dimension to reflecting on the 10-year cycle. It suggests something about the human condition, our tendency to forget, to repeat mistakes, to swing between excessive optimism and excessive pessimism. We'd like to think we're rational, learning creatures who improve with experience. But the 10-year cycle suggests our rationality is bounded, our learning imperfect, our memory short. We seem condemned to repeat the cycle. Not because we're stupid, but because we're human. Yet there's also something hopeful in understanding the pattern. If cycles are regular and predictable in their general outline, if not their specific timing, then we're not helpless victims of random economic chaos. We can prepare, we can plan, we can create institutions and policies that moderate the worst effects. We can't eliminate the cycle, but we can learn to navigate it more skillfully, to reduce the suffering it causes, to recover more quickly when downturns inevitably come. As we continue exploring economic cycles, we'll look at how different cycles vary despite their common pattern, at the psychological factors that drive repeated booms and busts, and at what we've learned about living with cycles we can't eliminate. But rest here now with this understanding of the 10-year rhythm. See it as a pattern in the complexity, a regularity in what might otherwise seem like chaos. The cycles continue, roughly a decade apart, driven by debt dynamics and fading memory, and the eternal human tendency to assume this time is different. Let yourself drift if you feel sleepy. The 10-year pattern we've explored is just observation, not prediction. It tells us that cycles recur, but not exactly when. There's no need for anxiety about timing, just understanding, just perspective, just the recognition that expansion and contraction follow each other in rhythms that span roughly a decade. Rest in that knowledge. Breathe slowly. Release any worry about economic futures. The patterns will unfold regardless of whether you're awake to witness them or sleeping peacefully. Let go now. The cycles continue their ancient rhythm while you rest. We've been exploring the curious regularity of economic cycles, the way they seem to repeat roughly every 10 years despite enormous changes in economic structure and policy frameworks. We've seen how debt accumulation, fading memory, and regulatory cycles all operate on similar timescales to create this pattern. But now we need to look more closely at something important. While cycles repeat with striking regularity, no two cycles are exactly alike. Each has its own character, its own causes, its own particular features that distinguish it from what came before and what will come after. Understanding this variation within the pattern is crucial. It helps us avoid mechanical thinking about cycles, the temptation to believe that because we've seen one cycle we understand them all. It reveals the complexity beneath the apparent simplicity, and it shows how economies evolve and adapt even as certain fundamental patterns persist. Let's think about what makes cycles different from one another. Some cycles are driven primarily by financial excesses, credit bubbles, asset price inflation, leverage building to dangerous levels. The 2008 crisis fits this pattern clearly. The boom was characterized by a massive housing bubble, by financial innovation that created complex and ultimately toxic mortgage-backed securities, by leverage throughout the financial system reaching levels not seen since the 1920s. When the bubble burst, the resulting recession was severe and long-lasting, because the financial system itself was damaged and required years to heal. Other cycles are driven more by real economy imbalances, overinvestment in particular sectors, inventory build-ups, shifts in consumer spending patterns. The 2001 recession fits this pattern better than the financial crisis model. The dot-com boom had seen massive overinvestment in internet and technology companies, much of it based on unrealistic projections of future profits. When reality disappointed, these companies failed, tech sector employment collapsed, and investment spending fell sharply. But the financial system remained basically healthy, So the recession, while painful, was relatively mild and short. Some cycles are triggered by external shocks rather than by internal imbalances reaching breaking points. The oil price shocks of the 1970s created recessions through a different mechanism than financial bubbles. When oil prices quadrupled virtually overnight due to the Arab oil embargo in 1973, it was like a massive tax on consumers and businesses in oil-importing countries. Money that would have been spent on other goods and services instead went to paying higher energy costs. Demand for other things fell, causing recession. The COVID-19 recession of 2020 was the most dramatic example of an externally triggered recession. The pandemic required governments to shut down large portions of their economies to slow viral spread. Restaurants, theatres, hotels, airlines, entire sectors essentially ceased operating. The resulting recession was the sharpest on record, with GDP falling at an annual rate of over 30% in the second quarter of 2020. But it was also unusual in its character, not caused by financial excesses or imbalances, but by a public health emergency requiring economic sacrifice. The distinction between supply shocks and demand shocks is useful for understanding cycle variation. Demand shocks occur when spending falls, consumers become cautious and reduce purchases, businesses cut investment, credit tightens and reduces the flow of money. Most financial crisis-driven recessions are demand shocks. People want to buy but can't because they lack income or credit. The solution is to restore demand through monetary and fiscal stimulus. Supply shocks occur when the economy's ability to produce is impaired by energy shortages, by pandemic restrictions, by natural disasters, by disruptions to supply chains. The 1970s oil shocks were supply shocks. The COVID recession had both supply and demand elements. Supply was restricted by shutdown orders, but demand also fell as people avoided activities they feared might spread infection. Supply shocks are trickier to address with policy, because simply boosting demand when supply is constrained can lead to inflation rather than increased output. Sector-specific cycles add another layer of variation. Sometimes a particular sector of the economy experiences a boom and bust that drives the broader cycle. Housing played this role in the 2000s. Residential construction went from about 4% of GDP at the trough to over 6% at the peak. When housing collapsed, it pulled down not just construction employment, but all the related industries, appliances, furniture, real estate services, mortgage lending. The housing sector's problems cascaded through the entire economy. Technology played a similar role in the late 1990s. Investment in information technology soared as companies rushed to adopt new systems and prepare for Y2K. Internet startups attracted billions in venture capital and public market investment. When the bubble burst and these investments proved largely unproductive, tech sector employment and investment collapsed. The broader economy followed into recession. Different sectors have different cycle dynamics. Manufacturing tends to be highly cyclical. Demand for manufactured goods swings widely with economic conditions. Services tend to be more stable. People continue to need haircuts and medical care even during recessions. Finance can be extremely volatile, alternating between boom periods of high profitability and bust periods of massive losses. Understanding which sectors are driving a particular cycle helps predict its likely severity and duration. Regional variation in cycles is also significant. The United States is a large country with diverse regional economies. Sometimes cycles affect all regions similarly, but often certain regions are hit much harder than others. The housing bust devastated Florida, Nevada, Arizona, and parts of California where housing bubbles had been most extreme. But it barely touched areas like Texas where housing prices had never surged. The oil price collapse of the mid-2000s hurt Texas and other oil-producing states, while benefiting oil-consuming regions. Manufacturing-heavy regions like the Midwest have experienced particularly severe cycles, as American manufacturing has faced global competition and automation. The recessions of the early 1980s and early 2000s thousands hit these regions especially hard, with unemployment in some industrial cities reaching depression-like levels even as the national economy recovered. These regional disparities create political tensions and contribute to diverging economic experiences within a single country. Global integration has increasingly meant that cycles in one country affect others. The 2008 financial crisis began in the United States, but quickly spread globally. European banks that had purchased American mortgage-backed securities suffered huge losses. Asian exporters saw demand for their products collapse as American and European consumers cut spending. What began as an American housing crisis became a global recession, the worst since the Great Depression. But global integration doesn't mean perfect synchronization. Different countries can experience cycles with different timing and severity. Japan's lost decade of the 1990s was specific to Japan, resulting from the collapse of enormous stock and real estate bubbles. While Japan stagnated, the United States enjoyed strong growth. The European debt crisis that followed the 2008 recession was specific to Europe, particularly countries like Greece, Spain, and Ireland that had accumulated unsustainable debts. The United States was recovering while Europe struggled. The causes of cycles matter enormously for policy responses. Financial crises require different solutions than real economy imbalances. Supply shocks require different responses than demand shocks. This is why central banks and governments must diagnose what's driving a particular cycle before determining appropriate policy. The same medicine doesn't work for all economic ailments. Financial crises, for instance, often require aggressive central bank intervention to prevent the freezing of credit markets. The Federal Reserve's response to 2008 included not just cutting interest rates to zero, but also unprecedented programs to inject liquidity into specific markets, buying mortgage-backed securities, lending directly to primary dealers, coordinating with other central banks to provide dollar liquidity globally. These extraordinary measures were necessary because the financial system itself was broken. In contrast, the 2001 recession required less dramatic intervention. The Federal Reserve cut interest rates substantially, providing conventional monetary stimulus. But there was no need for the kind of emergency liquidity programs deployed in 2008, because banks remained healthy and credit markets functioned normally. The problem was insufficient demand, which could be addressed with standard tools. Supply shocks like the 1970s oil crises present a dilemma for policymakers. Boosting demand when supply is constrained just causes inflation, but allowing recession to run its course causes unemployment and suffering. The Federal Reserve in the 1970s tried to split the difference, providing some stimulus but not enough to fully offset the supply shock. The result was stagflation, simultaneous inflation and recession, a combination that conventional economic models suggested was impossible but that characterized much of the decade. The severity of recessions varies dramatically depending on their causes and the policy responses. The Great Recession saw unemployment peak at 10% and last 18 months officially, with effects lingering for years. The 2001 recession saw unemployment peak at 6% and last only 8 months. The COVID recession saw unemployment spike to nearly 15%, but recover relatively quickly as reopening occurred and aggressive fiscal support sustained incomes. The length of recoveries also varies. Some recessions are followed by robust V-shaped recoveries where growth quickly returns to trend. The early 1980s double-dip recessions were followed by strong growth through the rest of the decade. Other recessions lead to sluggish L-shaped recoveries where growth remains weak for years. The Great Recession led to a painfully slow recovery, with GDP growth averaging only about 2% annually for several years and unemployment taking nearly 6 years to return to pre-crisis levels. The shape of recovery depends partly on the nature of the recession. Financial crisis recessions tend to have slower recoveries because deleveraging takes time, because credit remains constrained even after the acute crisis passes, because damaged balance sheets limit spending and investment. Real economy recessions without financial damage tend to have quicker recoveries once confidence returns and demand resumes. Policy choices also affect recovery shapes. Aggressive fiscal stimulus can shorten recessions and accelerate recoveries by directly boosting demand. The choice to pursue austerity, cutting government spending to reduce deficits, during recovery can prolong weakness by removing support before the private sector is ready to stand on its own. The debate between stimulus and austerity has been central to economic policy discussions following recent recessions. Inflation dynamics vary across cycles in ways that matter enormously. The 1970s saw high and rising inflation that became embedded in expectations, creating a wage price spiral that was extremely difficult to break. The Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker in the early 1980s had to induce severe recession through very high interest rates to finally kill inflation. This experience scarred a generation of policymakers and made price stability a paramount concern. More recent cycles have featured very low inflation, sometimes raising concerns about deflation. Following the Great Recession, despite massive monetary stimulus, inflation remained below the Federal Reserve's 2% target for years. This low inflation reflected weak demand, global competition, technological change, and other factors. It meant that concerns about stimulus causing runaway inflation proved unfounded, and that policymakers had more room to support recovery than they initially thought. The evolution of monetary policy frameworks across cycles represents learning and adaptation. Early post-war policy was guided by Keynesian ideas about demand management. The 1970s stagflation discredited simple Keynesianism and led to the monetarist revolution associated with Milton Friedman, which emphasized money supply control and inflation fighting. This evolved into inflation targeting in the 1990s and 2000s, where central banks committed to keeping inflation near a specific target, typically around 2%. The 2008 crisis showed the limits of pure inflation targeting when interest rates hit zero and conventional monetary policy became ineffective. Central banks had to innovate, developing unconventional tools like quantitative easing, forward guidance, and negative interest rates. Each crisis teaches lessons that influence how the next crisis is handled, creating a ratchet effect where policy capabilities gradually expand. Fiscal policy has also evolved across cycles. The initial post-war period saw activist fiscal policy, willingness to run deficits during recessions to support demand. The 1980s through 2000s saw more emphasis on balanced budgets and fiscal discipline. The 2008 crisis, and especially the COVID crisis, saw renewed embrace of aggressive fiscal policy, with governments running unprecedented peacetime deficits to support economies through crisis and recovery. These policy evolutions mean that even if the underlying cycle dynamics remain similar, the outcomes can differ because we've gotten better at responding. The Great Recession, while severe, didn't become another Great Depression partly because policymakers had studied the Depression and understood the mistakes that deepened it. Aggressive monetary and fiscal responses prevented financial collapse from causing a complete economic collapse. The relationship between financial markets and the real economy varies across cycles. Sometimes stock market crashes trigger recessions by destroying wealth and confidence. Sometimes recessions occur without major stock market disruption. Sometimes stock markets recover quickly even as the real economy struggles. The COVID recession saw markets bottom in March 2020 and reach new highs by August while unemployment remained above 10%. This disconnect reflected massive monetary stimulus and the fact that large corporations represented in stock indices adapted better to the pandemic than small businesses. Housing's role in cycles has varied. Housing was central to the 2008 crisis but played little role in 2001. The housing market's behaviour depends on factors like interest rates, lending standards, demographics, and regional supply constraints. When housing booms and busts, the effects are particularly severe because housing represents most household wealth and because housing-related sectors employ many workers. When housing is stable, cycles tend to be milder. International trade and capital flows create channels through which cycles spread globally, but also create variation in how cycles affect different countries. Export-dependent economies suffer more when global demand contracts. Countries with large current account deficits are vulnerable to sudden stops in capital flows. Countries with their own currencies and floating exchange rates have more policy flexibility than those in currency unions like the euro. The increasing complexity and interconnection of the global financial system means that crisis transmission has become faster and more unpredictable. The 2008 crisis spread globally in weeks. Asset price correlations increase during crises as investors sell everything to raise cash. This makes diversification less effective precisely when it's most needed, and means that crises that start in one small corner of the financial system can quickly engulf the whole. Technological change affects cycle dynamics in subtle ways. The internet bubble was driven by a genuine technological revolution. The internet really did transform commerce and communication. But the boom extrapolated these changes too far too fast, funding businesses that had no viable model. More recently, automation and artificial intelligence are transforming labour markets in ways that may affect future cycle dynamics, potentially creating structural unemployment that persists even during expansions. Demographic changes also shape cycles. The aging of populations in developed countries affects saving behaviour, investment needs, and government finances. An older population typically saves more and spends less, which can contribute to weak demand. But aging also creates demands for healthcare and other services. The baby boom generation's movement through different life stages has influenced American economic cycles for decades. Climate change and environmental factors are beginning to affect economic cycles in ways that will likely become more important. Extreme weather events disrupt supply chains and destroy capital. Transition to renewable energy requires massive investment, but also makes fossil fuel assets stranded. These dynamics will shape future cycles in ways that previous generations didn't. Face. Despite all this variation, certain commonalities persist across cycles. All involve some version of boom and bust. All feature credit playing a central role. All demonstrate how optimism and pessimism swing too far in both directions. All eventually end and give way to the next phase. The variation is real and important, but it occurs within a recognizable pattern. Understanding that each cycle is different prevents mechanical thinking about economic policy and investment. What worked in the last recession might not work in the next if the underlying causes are different. The timing and severity of cycles can't be predicted with precision because too many factors influence them. Humility about what we know and can predict is warranted. At the same time, understanding the common patterns beneath the variation provides valuable guidance. We know that booms eventually end even if we can't predict exactly when. We know that crashes eventually bottom out even if we can't time the trough. We know that policy responses matter even if the optimal response varies by circumstances. We know that recoveries eventually come even if their shape and speed vary. This combination of pattern and variation, of regularity and unpredictability, is perhaps the deepest truth about economic cycles. They're regular enough to be understood and prepared for, but varied enough to humble anyone who claims to have mastered them. They're predictable in their general outline but surprising in their specifics. They repeat but never exactly the same way twice. As we continue exploring cycles, we'll turn to the psychological factors that drive the repeated patterns of boom and bust, the human tendencies that seem to ensure cycles recur despite growing knowledge and experience. But rest here now with this understanding of variation within pattern. See how each cycle has its own story while fitting a larger template. Appreciate both the uniqueness of historical moments and the rhythms that connect them across decades and centuries. Let yourself drift if you're feeling sleepy. The cycles we've been exploring in all their variation and complexity will continue whether you're awake to study them or sleeping peacefully. There's no urgency, no need to grasp every detail. The broad understanding is what matters, that cycles repeat but vary, that patterns persist but adapt, that knowledge accumulates even as fundamental dynamics remain. Rest in that understanding. Breathe slowly. Release your attention. The economic patterns will unfold in their own time while you rest in yours. Sleep well. We've been exploring how economic cycles, while following a recognizable pattern, vary considerably in their specific features, how financial crises differ from real economy recessions, how supply shocks create different challenges than demand shocks, how each cycle has its own character despite fitting a larger template. Now we need to turn to something more fundamental, more deeply human, the psychological factors that ensure these cycles keep repeating despite our growing knowledge and experience. Why do we seem unable to learn from history? Why does each generation rediscover boom and bust for itself? What is it about human nature that makes economic cycles so persistent? The answer lies in how we think, how we remember, how we respond to uncertainty, and how we interact with each other. Economics isn't just about numbers and policies and market mechanisms. At its heart, it's about human behavior, human psychology, human nature with all its beauty and all its limitations. Understanding this psychological dimension helps us see why cycles persist and why they're so difficult to prevent or moderate. Let's start with something called recency bias. This is our tendency to give disproportionate weight to recent experience when forming expectations about the future. It's a kind of mental shortcut, a heuristic that usually works reasonably well but can lead us astray in important ways. If housing prices have been rising for 5 years, recency bias makes us expect they'll keep rising. If the stock market has delivered strong returns for a decade, we expect similar returns in the future. We extrapolate recent trends forward as if they'll continue indefinitely. This makes perfect sense from an evolutionary perspective. For most of human history, the near past was indeed the best guide to the near future. Weather patterns, seasonal cycles, animal migrations, these things were relatively stable and predictable. A mental shortcut that assumed tomorrow would be like today was adaptive. But in economic and financial contexts, where conditions can change dramatically, recency bias becomes dangerous. It causes us to become most optimistic precisely when we should be most cautious, and most pessimistic precisely when opportunities are greatest. During the late stages of a boom, recency bias is everywhere. People have experienced years of rising asset prices, strong employment, growing incomes. This recent experience shapes their expectations. They can't imagine a different future. When they try to envision what comes next, their minds automatically project forward the trends they've experienced. Housing prices will keep rising because that's what they've been doing. Stocks will keep climbing because that's what the recent past shows. Jobs will remain plentiful because that's the current reality. This extrapolation isn't stupid or irrational in any simple sense. These people are using the information available to them, their lived experience, to form reasonable forecasts. The problem is that economic cycles turn, and when they do, the recent past becomes a terrible guide to the future. But by the time the turn becomes obvious, it's too late. Those who acted on recency bias, who borrowed heavily because they expected rising incomes, who bought overpriced assets because they expected further price increases, are exposed and vulnerable. Confirmation bias compounds recency bias in powerful ways. Confirmation bias is our tendency to seek out, notice, and remember information that confirms our existing beliefs while ignoring or discounting information that contradicts them. During booms, when we believe prosperity will continue, we notice and remember the positive economic news while dismissing negative news as anomalies or irrelevant. We seek out analysis that supports our optimism and avoid analysis that suggests caution. This happens unconsciously. We're not deliberately choosing to be one-sided in our information consumption. Rather, our attention and memory naturally gravitate toward confirming information because it's psychologically comfortable. Information that challenges our beliefs creates cognitive dissonance, uncomfortable psychological tension, so we unconsciously avoid or minimize it. During booms, skeptics and warnings are tuned out. They're dismissed as the complaints of perennial pessimists who don't understand the new paradigm. The media environment reinforces confirmation bias. During booms, business media coverage is overwhelmingly positive. Stories about successful companies, rising markets, wealth creation. This positive coverage reflects what's happening but also shapes expectations. People who consume this media diet naturally become more optimistic, and that optimism drives behavior, more spending, more borrowing, more risk-taking, that fuels the boom further. Anchoring is another cognitive bias that affects economic behavior. Anchoring occurs when we rely too heavily on an initial piece of information, the anchor, when making decisions. In housing markets, anchoring to previous peak prices creates resistance to price declines. Homeowners who bought when prices were at their peak anchor to the price they paid. When prices fall, they're reluctant to sell for less than their anchor price, even if market conditions clearly indicate the house is worth less now. This anchoring slows price adjustment and can prolong housing market downturns. In investment contexts, anchoring to previous portfolio values affects decision-making. Investors who saw their portfolios reach high values during the boom anchor to those peaks. When prices fall, they're reluctant to sell at the new lower prices because doing so means accepting that the peak value is gone. This reluctance to realize losses can lead to holding declining assets too long, turning paper losses into permanent ones. Herding behavior, our tendency to do what others are doing rather than relying on our own information, is perhaps the most powerful psychological factor in boom and bust cycles. Humans are intensely social creatures. We take cues from those around us about what's normal, what's safe, what's wise. When everyone around us is buying stocks or real estate, when our neighbours and colleagues are profiting from the boom, when media coverage treats participation as obviously smart, the social pressure to join is enormous. Herding isn't irrational in a simple sense. In many contexts, following the crowd is actually wise. If everyone is running away from something, it's probably dangerous. If everyone is lining up for something, it's probably valuable. The problem is that in financial markets, herding can create self-fulfilling prophecies. When everyone buys, prices rise, which validates the decision to buy and attracts more buyers. The feedback loop creates bubbles that eventually must burst. Herding also provides psychological cover. If everyone is doing it, it can't be that risky, can it? And if things go wrong, at least you won't be alone in your losses. There's comfort in shared failure. This psychological comfort makes herding feel safe even when it's dangerous. During the housing boom, lax lending standards and risky borrowing practices seemed acceptable because everyone was doing it. The collective behaviour normalised what in other circumstances would have seemed obviously reckless. The fear of missing out, FOMO in modern parlance, drives behaviour during late booms with particular intensity. Watching others get wealthy while you sit on the sidelines is psychologically painful. There's a sense that you're being left behind, that everyone else understands something you don't, that you're missing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. This fear overwhelms more cautious impulses. Better to participate and risk losing money than to sit out and certainly miss gains. FOMO is amplified by social media and modern communication technology. In earlier eras, you might have learned about your neighbour's investment success occasionally in conversation. Now you see constant updates about others' gains, about opportunities that seem to be everywhere. The psychological impact is intense and constant. The pressure to participate becomes harder and harder to resist as the boom matures and success stories multiply. Loss aversion, identified by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, describes how losses hurt more psychologically than equivalent gains feel good. We feel the pain of losing $100 more intensely than the pleasure of gaining $100. This asymmetry affects economic behavior in important ways. During booms, loss aversion makes people reluctant to sell appreciating assets. Selling means risking the loss of further gains. During busts, loss aversion can make people hold losing positions too long, unable to accept the psychological pain of realizing losses. Loss aversion also explains panic selling during crashes. Once losses become large enough, the psychological pain becomes unbearable. People sell not because they've rationally calculated that selling is optimal, but because they can't stand the pain of watching their losses grow. This emotional selling at exactly the wrong time, selling low when buying high would have been better, represents loss aversion, overwhelming rational calculation. Overconfidence is pervasive in economic decision-making. We consistently overestimate our knowledge, our abilities, our control over outcomes. Investors believe they can identify undervalued stocks or time markets, even though evidence shows that almost no one can do this consistently. Business owners believe their ventures will succeed, even though most new businesses fail. Homebuyers believe they can afford mortgages based on optimistic projections of future income, even though life is uncertain. During booms, overconfidence reaches peaks. Success breeds belief in one's own abilities. People who made money during the boom attribute it to their skill rather than to favorable market conditions. This overconfidence encourages taking greater risks, more leverage, more aggressive investments, more optimistic projections. The success that fed the overconfidence continues until it doesn't, and then the overconfident are especially vulnerable to losses. Availability bias, where we judge the probability of events based on how easily we can recall examples, affects how we assess risks. Recent vivid events are more available to memory than distant abstract ones. During booms, memories of the last recession fade and become less available. The recent experience of prosperity is vivid and easily recalled. This makes recession seem unlikely, and further risk-taking seems safe. By the time 7 or 8 years have passed since the last recession, it's psychologically distant, almost abstract. The vivid recent experience of prosperity overwhelms the fading memory of past downturns. Conversely, immediately after a crash or recession, the pain is vivid and fresh. Memories of losses are easily recalled. This makes people cautious, risk-averse, pessimistic about future prospects. But this too is bias. The vivid recent pain makes negative outcomes seem more likely than they actually are. This excessive pessimism at troughs creates opportunities for those able to overcome it, just as excessive optimism at peaks creates dangers for those caught up in it. Present bias, our tendency to prioritize immediate gratification over future benefits, encourages behavior that feeds booms. Borrowing provides immediate consumption in exchange for future payment obligation. During booms, the immediate benefit feels real and important, while the future obligation feels distant and manageable. People take on debt to enjoy consumption now, discounting the future burden. This works fine as long as incomes rise, but when cycles turn and incomes fall, the future obligations that seemed manageable become crushing. Present bias also affects saving behavior. Saving requires sacrificing present consumption for future security. This is psychologically difficult even when it's clearly rational. During booms, when the present feels prosperous and the future seems secure, the sacrifice required to save seems unnecessary. Why save when you're doing well and expect to do even better? This failure to save during good times leaves people vulnerable when bad times inevitably arrive. The illusion of control makes us believe we have more influence over outcomes than we actually do. We believe that through skill, effort, or strategy, we can achieve specific results, when in reality much depends on factors beyond our control: economic cycles, market movements, technological changes, policy decisions, random events. This illusion encourages risk-taking. If you believe you control outcomes, taking risks seems reasonable. The reality that much is beyond our control only becomes clear when things go wrong. Mental accounting, where we treat money differently depending on arbitrary categories, affects economic behaviour in subtle ways. People might carefully budget regular income while freely spending windfalls. They might be conservative with savings accounts while taking big risks in investment accounts. They might pay down low-interest debt while carrying high-interest debt because the accounts feel different. These seemingly irrational behaviours stem from mental accounting, treating economically equivalent money differently based on psychological categories. During booms, mental accounting can make appreciated assets feel like free money to spend. Homeowners who see their house value rise might extract equity through refinancing and spend it freely, treating it differently than earned income even though economically it's the same, a reduction in net worth. This mental accounting turns paper gains into real spending, amplifying booms but leaving people vulnerable when asset prices fall. Bounded rationality, a concept developed by Herbert Simon, recognizes that human rationality has limits. We don't have infinite information processing capacity. We can't analyze every option exhaustively. We use mental shortcuts and rules of thumb that work reasonably well most of the time, but can fail in extreme situations. Economic cycles push us into extreme situations where our normal heuristics fail. But we often don't recognize this until it's too late. The principal-agent problem describes situations where the person making decisions, the agent, doesn't bear the full consequences of those decisions because they're acting on behalf of someone else, the principal. In financial markets, this is everywhere. Fund managers invest other people's money. Mortgage brokers make loans that banks hold. Corporate executives make decisions affecting shareholders. In each case, the incentives facing the agent may differ from what's best for the principal. During booms, principal-agent problems can drive excessive risk-taking. A fund manager who takes big risks and succeeds gets bonuses and fame. If the risks fail, the manager might lose their job, but the losses fall on clients. This asymmetric payoff encourages taking more risk than is prudent. Mortgage brokers who were paid for originating loans, regardless of whether they were repaid, had incentives to make as many loans as possible. Quality be damned. These incentive structures contributed to the housing bubble and financial crisis. Groupthink within institutions and policy-making bodies leads to bad decisions during both booms and busts. When everyone in an organisation or committee shares similar views, challenges and alternative perspectives get suppressed. During booms, groupthink leads to collective denial of building risks. Skeptics within organisations either convince themselves to go along with the consensus or they leave. This creates echo chambers where everyone reinforces each other's optimism and warning signs get ignored or rationalised away. The "this time is different" syndrome, documented by economists Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff, represents the ultimate psychological barrier to learning from history. Every boom is accompanied by narratives explaining why old rules don't apply, why past cycles are irrelevant, why the current situation is fundamentally different. The specific narratives change. Sometimes it's new technology, sometimes better policy, sometimes structural changes. But the underlying belief is always the same. What happened before can't happen now. This belief allows people to ignore historical patterns and warnings. When skeptics point to previous bubbles and crashes, the response is that circumstances were different then, that we've learned from past mistakes, that modern understanding and tools prevent repetition. This belief isn't crazy. Circumstances do differ, and we do learn. But the belief usually goes too far, minimizing fundamental continuities in human behavior and economic dynamics that ensure cycles recur despite surface differences. The challenge is that sometimes things really are different. The economy does evolve, technology does change things, policy frameworks do improve. Distinguishing between genuine structural changes and the quote "seven delusion" is extraordinarily difficult in real time. We can only know for certain in retrospect, after the cycle has played out. This uncertainty makes it hard to apply historical lessons. Maybe this time really is different, or maybe we're repeating the same old mistakes. Social proof and authority bias make us more likely to believe and follow experts, celebrities, and successful people, even when their track record doesn't justify such confidence. During booms, successful investors and business leaders are celebrated as geniuses. Their pronouncements are treated as wisdom. People follow their advice and example without critically examining whether their success was skill or luck, whether their current optimism is justified. The reality is that most exceptional success involves substantial luck, being in the right place at the right time, benefiting from favourable circumstances. But we attribute success to personal qualities and genius, which makes us more likely to follow these quote 8 people into increasingly risky territory during late booms. The same people who were celebrated as geniuses during the boom are often revealed as merely lucky, or sometimes reckless, when the bust arrives. The sunk cost fallacy, where we continue investing in losing ventures because of what we've already invested, affects behaviour during downturns. People hold losing stocks because they've already lost so much that selling feels like admitting failure. Homeowners continue paying mortgages on underwater homes because walking away would mean losing their down payment and all previous payments. Businesses continue failing projects because of all the money already spent. Economically, sunk costs should be ignored. They're gone regardless. But psychologically, they weigh heavily. Cognitive dissonance. The uncomfortable tension we feel when holding contradictory beliefs or when our beliefs conflict with our actions drives behaviour in subtle ways. Someone who believes they're financially prudent but who has taken on excessive debt experiences dissonance. Rather than changing behaviour to match beliefs, they often change beliefs to match behaviour, convincing themselves that the debt is actually reasonable, that their situation is different, that they have it under control. This allows risky behaviour to continue and escalate. The psychological factors we've explored aren't flaws or failures exactly. They're features of how human minds work. Adaptations that served us well in evolutionary contexts. The problem is that modern financial and economic systems create situations where these mental features produce systematically problematic outcomes. We're running software, human psychology, that was designed for a different operating environment, and the bugs show up most dramatically during extreme phases of economic cycles. Understanding these psychological factors doesn't make us immune to them. Even people who study cognitive biases extensively fall prey to them. Knowledge helps at the margin. Awareness of our biases can make us slightly more cautious, slightly more willing to question our assumptions. But it doesn't eliminate the biases. They're too deeply embedded in how we think and feel to be simply overcome through willpower or knowledge. This explains why cycles persist despite growing economic knowledge and policy sophistication. The fundamental problem isn't lack of knowledge. We understand cycle dynamics much better than previous generations did. The fundamental problem is human nature. As long as humans are making economic decisions, as long as we're subject to recency bias and herding and overconfidence and all the rest, cycles will recur. We might moderate them, but we can't eliminate them. There's something humbling but also oddly comforting in this recognition. It means that cycles aren't anyone's fault exactly. They emerge from the collective operation of psychological tendencies that are universal and largely unchangeable. Understanding this can reduce the blame and scapegoating that often follow crashes. Yes, specific actors often behave badly, committing fraud, taking reckless risks, prioritizing short-term gain over long-term sustainability. But the broader pattern of boom and bust emerges from normal human psychology operating in market systems. It also means we should be gentle with ourselves and others about cycle-driven mistakes. Taking on too much debt during a boom, failing to sell before a crash, becoming overly pessimistic during a recession. These are human responses to the situations we face, influenced by powerful psychological forces. Beating ourselves up about these mistakes is less useful than understanding the psychological factors that drove them and trying to build systems and practices that account for our limitations. The persistence of psychological biases across cycles also suggests the value of humility and caution. If we know we're prone to overconfidence during booms, we can consciously try to be more cautious even when we feel confident. If we know herding drives us to follow the crowd, we can consciously ask whether we're making independent judgments or just following. The biases will still operate, but conscious awareness can provide some counterbalance. As we move toward the conclusion of our exploration, we'll consider what we've learned about living with cycles we can't eliminate. But rest here now with this understanding of the human element in economic cycles. See how understandable it all is, how natural, how inevitable given how our minds work. Release any judgment about these psychological tendencies. They're just part of being human, neither good nor bad. Just features of our cognitive architecture that produce certain patterns when we interact in market systems. Fiscal policy, the use of government taxing and spending to influence the economy, has also evolved. The concept of counter-cyclical fiscal policy, running deficits during recessions to support demand, running surpluses during booms to cool overheating, became accepted wisdom in the post-war era. In practice, the discipline to run surpluses during good times has been harder to maintain than the willingness to run deficits during bad times. But even imperfect counter-cyclical policy helps moderate cycles. The automatic stabilizers built into modern government budgets also help. Unemployment insurance automatically increases government spending during recessions as more people claim benefits, providing support to those affected and maintaining aggregate demand. Progressive income taxes automatically reduce tax burdens during downturns as incomes fall, leaving more money in private hands. These automatic mechanisms work without requiring explicit policy decisions, providing immediate stabilization. But there are fundamental limits to what policy can achieve. Central banks can moderate cycles but can't eliminate them. Fiscal policy can support demand during recessions, but faces political and economic constraints. Debt can't grow indefinitely. Tax increases face resistance. Spending programs create constituencies that resist cuts during booms. Regulation can reduce excessive risk-taking but can't eliminate risk entirely without also eliminating the dynamism that makes market economies productive. The question of whether cycles could theoretically be eliminated is interesting philosophically, but perhaps not practically relevant. The kinds of controls that would be necessary to prevent all boom-bust dynamics, complete government control of credit allocation, rigid restrictions on asset transactions, elimination of market pricing, would transform the system into something unrecognizable and probably much less productive. The trade-off between stability and dynamism appears to be real. The cycles are, in some sense, the price we pay for having an economy that's adaptive, innovative, and responsive to changing conditions. This doesn't mean we're helpless. While we can't eliminate cycles, we can reduce their severity and better protect people from their effects. The social safety net, unemployment insurance, food assistance, Medicaid, disability insurance, catches people when they fall and provides basic security that didn't exist in earlier eras. These programs have enormous economic benefits beyond their humanitarian value. They maintain demand during recessions, preventing downward spirals from becoming as severe as they otherwise would. Some economists argue that cycles might become longer as policy improves. Better crisis response prevents recessions from starting or curtails them quickly. Better regulation prevents imbalances from building as rapidly. Longer cycles would mean less frequent disruption, which sounds positive. But longer cycles might also mean more severe crashes when they eventually come, more time for imbalances to build, more forgetting of previous crises, more confidence that this time really is different. There's also a question of whether technological and structural changes might alter cycle dynamics. The shift from manufacturing to services, the rise of the gig economy, increasing automation, climate change effects, all of these could influence how cycles play out. Services employment tends to be more stable than manufacturing, which might moderate cycles, but the precariousness of gig work might make labour markets more volatile. The relationships aren't obvious and will only become clear over time. For businesses, Cycle awareness suggests maintaining financial flexibility. Companies that enter recessions with strong balance sheets, minimal debt, and cash reserves can not only survive but thrive, buying distressed assets cheaply, hiring talented workers let go by struggling competitors, gaining market share from failing firms. Companies that leveraged heavily during the boom to maximize growth often don't survive the bust. Business cycle management also suggests investing counter-cyclically when possible. During booms, when everyone is expanding and competing for resources, costs are high. During recessions, when resources are idle and competition is weak, costs are low. Companies that can maintain or even increase investment during downturns emerge stronger when recovery comes. This requires both financial capacity and psychological fortitude to invest when conventional wisdom says to hunker down. For policymakers, the lessons are both encouraging and humbling. We have tools that work. Aggressive monetary and fiscal response can prevent crashes from becoming catastrophes. Financial regulation can reduce excessive risk-taking. Social safety nets can protect people from the worst effects of downturns. These tools should be maintained and used when needed. Climate change will increasingly interact with economic cycles in ways we're just beginning to understand. Extreme weather events disrupt economic activity and require reconstruction spending. Transition to carbon-neutral energy systems requires massive investment that will come in waves, potentially creating boom-bust dynamics in green technology sectors. Climate-related financial risks, stranded fossil fuel assets, coastal property devaluation could trigger financial instability. Managing these novel challenges while also managing traditional cycle dynamics will test policy capacity. Rest now with this knowledge. The cycles we've explored together will continue whether you're awake or sleeping, whether you understand them or not. But understanding brings perspective, reduces fear, suggests wise action. You've gained that understanding through our journey together. Carry it lightly as you drift towards sleep. The economic patterns will unfold in their own time. You're safe here, comfortable, at peace. The cycles are just patterns, not threats. Understanding them is enough. Sleep well now. We've travelled a long road together tonight, through the rhythms of economic life that have pulsed through human civilization for as long as people have exchanged goods and built enterprises. We've seen how economies breathe, expanding and contracting, rising and falling, like tides pulled by invisible moons. We've explored not just the mechanics of these cycles, but their human heart, the hopes and fears and eternal optimism that drive them forward. You understand now that the economy crashes every 10 years or so, not because we're foolish, or because systems are broken beyond repair, but because we're human. We forget. We hope. We dream of better futures, and sometimes those dreams carry us too far. And then we stumble, we fall, we pick ourselves up, and begin again. This has always been our way. This will always be our way. There's wisdom in accepting this rhythm rather than fighting it. The cycles aren't punishment or failure. They're simply the pattern that emerges when millions of people make decisions about uncertain futures, when optimism meets reality, when memory fades and must be renewed through experience. Understanding this brings a kind of peace. You are part of this ancient story. Your work, your choices, your small daily acts of creation and exchange, they're threads in the vast tapestry of human commerce that stretches back millennia and forward into futures we can't yet imagine. The cycles will continue, booms will become, busts will become recoveries, will become booms again. The 10-year rhythm will pulse on, and through it all human resilience will endure. So rest now, truly rest. Let your breathing slow to match the deeper rhythm we've been exploring, the long, patient breath of economic cycles, the inhale of expansion, the pause at the peak, the exhale of contraction, the quiet stillness at the trough before the next breath begins. You're safe in this rhythm. You understand it now. There's nothing to fear, nothing to solve, nothing to do but rest. The patterns will continue without your attention. The economy will breathe in and breathe out. Somewhere, someone is building something new. Somewhere, someone is weathering difficulty. Somewhere, recovery is beginning. The great wheel turns as it always has, as it always will. Let it all go now. Let the cycle spin on without you. Let the knowledge settle deep in your mind where it will rest. Available when needed, but quiet now, so quiet. You've learned what you came to learn. You've understood what needed understanding. Now there's only sleep, deep and peaceful and complete. Breathe in slowly. Hold. Breathe out slowly. Feel yourself sinking, settling, releasing. The economic cycles, with all their drama and pattern, fade into the background. In the foreground is only this moment, this breath, this gentle drift towards sleep. Everything is as it should be. The cycles continue their ancient dance, and you simply let go. Sleep now.